Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The drive from Madison to Milwaukee usually takes about an hour and 20 minutes, but on Thanksgiving night, the empty interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the November moon. My graduation from nursing school in 2008 meant I'd been making this exact trip for over a decade now, always promising Mom I'd text when I got home safe. That night, stomach still full of turkey and green bean casserole, I had the heat cranked up and some true crime podcast playing through the speakers. The host was describing how predators often work in pairs when my headlights caught something moving near the tree line. At first I thought it was just a deer. Wisconsin has millions of them. But then I saw it was smaller, walking weird, favoring one side like it was hurt bad. I pulled over about 30 feet ahead of where I'd seen it, leaving the engine running because something deep in my gut told me to keep the car ready. When I cracked my door open, the dome light illuminated the shoulder, and there it was. This medium-sized dog, maybe 40 pounds, brown and white patches, dragging its back left leg. Poor thing looked like it had been clipped by a car. Not bad enough to be dying, but definitely needing help. The way it whimpered when it tried to walk made my nurse instincts kick in hard. I grabbed the blanket from my back seat, the one I keep for emergencies, thinking I could wrap it up and get it to the emergency vet clinic near my apartment. The dog stayed about 15 feet away, not running but not coming closer either, just standing there shaking in the cold Wisconsin air. That's when I heard the other car approaching behind me, which wasn't unusual, except it slowed down and stopped maybe 20 feet back. No headlights though, which struck me as strange because the highway was dark as hell that night, just their parking lights glowing amber. I figured maybe they saw my hazards and thought I needed help. Happens all the time on these rural stretches. But then, both doors opened at the exact same time, synchronized like they'd practiced it, and two people got out. In my side mirror, I could only make out their shapes against the faint light from their car interior before they shut the doors. One was definitely bigger, broader shoulders, and they both moved with this purposeful walk that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "Buster, there you are, buddy," the smaller one called out, voice carrying clear in the still night air. But something about the tone was all wrong, too rehearsed like reading from a script. The dog didn't react at all, didn't turn its head, didn't wag its tail, nothing. Just kept looking at me with those pain-filled eyes. The bigger one started making kissing sounds, the kind you'd make to call your pet, but he was walking toward my car, not toward the dog. My hand was still on the door handle, half in and half out of the driver's seat, when the smaller one said something that made my whole body go rigid. "Ma'am, could you help us grab him? He doesn't trust strangers, but if you're already out of your car." The dog was between us and them, but neither of them was looking at it. They were both looking at me. Every self-defense class I'd ever taken, every warning my dad had drilled into me since I was 16, it all crystallized in that moment. I yanked my leg back into the car so fast I knocked my knee against the steering column, slammed the door, and hit the lock button. The bigger one broke into a run the second my door closed, and I mean full sprint, covering the distance to my car in seconds. His fist hit my window hard enough that I thought it might crack, and his face pressed against the glass, mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear over my own screaming. My transmission was still in park, and my fingers felt thick and clumsy as I fumbled for the gear shift. The smaller one had circled around to the passenger side, trying the handle, then pounding on that window too, and between their bodies blocking my mirrors, I couldn't see anything behind me to reverse safely. The dog just stood there through all of this, hadn't moved an inch despite the chaos, and that detail hit me even through my panic. A real injured dog would have bolted or at least reacted to two people running and yelling. I threw the car in drive instead of reverse, flooring it forward, tires squealing on the asphalt. My rearview mirror, illuminated red by my taillights, I saw them running back to their car, and that's when I noticed they'd left both doors open the whole time, ready for a quick pursuit. My speedometer hit 80 before I even realized it, taking the curves of that dark highway way too fast. But I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a gas station about 3 miles ahead. My phone was in the cup holder and I grabbed it at a red light, calling 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. The operator kept me on the line while I pulled into the gas station, parking right in front of the doors where the cameras and lights were. I gave her the mile marker, described the car as best I could. Dark sedan, maybe a Chrysler or Dodge, no front plate that I could see. The two people, one about 6 feet, heavy build, wearing what looked like a baseball cap, the other shorter, thinner, both in dark clothes. While I was talking, a highway patrol officer arrived at the gas station, apparently already in the area, and he took my full statement right there in the parking lot. He radioed for another unit to check that stretch of highway, then looked me straight in the eye and said something that made me want to throw up. "You did the right thing driving off." We've had 2 reports this month of a similar setup. Same area, fake injured animal near the forest. What really got me was when he asked about the dog's behavior, nodding when I described how it didn't react to them calling it or to the commotion. "Probably trained for this," he said, explaining that some people teach dogs to limp on command, reward them for staying still no matter what's happening around them. The thought of someone taking what could have been a sweet family pet and turning it into bait for God knows what made me sick. Another officer called in about 20 minutes later, said they'd found fresh tire marks where I'd described but no sign of the car or the dog. They increased patrols in that area for weeks afterward, but as far as I know, they never caught them. The officer gave me his card, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if I felt unsafe, and suggested I vary my routes home for a while. I didn't sleep that night, or the next 3 nights actually, just kept replaying every second in my mind. The way they moved in perfect coordination, how the smaller one's voice had this fake concerned quality, like someone who'd practiced the line too many times. I started researching similar incidents online and found a rabbit hole of forum posts from truckers and late-night drivers across the Midwest. Same pattern in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, always rural highways, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., always targeting women driving alone. Some posts described different bait scenarios, a person flagging for help whose partner hides in the ditch, abandoned baby carriers on the shoulder that are empty when you get close, even fake accident scenes. The consensus was that these operations usually involve human trafficking rings, targeting isolated victims on empty stretches where screams won't be heard and witnesses are non-existent. My mom called the next morning, casual as always, asking if I'd gotten home safe like she always did after family dinners. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened, just said yes, traffic was light, everything was fine. But I've told pretty much everyone else, especially women who drive alone, because that's the thing that haunts me most. If I hadn't kept my engine running, if I'd walked those extra 15 feet toward that dog, if I'd been just a little more trusting or a little less paranoid, I would have been another missing person case. They would have found my car on the side of the highway, door open, hazard still blinking, and no trace of where I'd gone. My family would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened between Madison and Milwaukee on a cold Thanksgiving night. The detective who followed up a week later told me something that explained why they probably chose that specific spot. The forest there connects to a maze of old logging roads, unmapped paths that lead deep into wilderness where nobody goes in winter. Perfect for moving vehicles unseen, for transferring victims, for making people disappear. He also mentioned that the timing wasn't random. Holiday nights when police are dealing with drunk drivers and domestic calls, when response times to rural areas are slowest. These people had clearly done their homework, studied patterns, knew exactly when and where to set their trap. The fake limp was probably practiced hundreds of times, the dog conditioned with treats and praise until it could hold that injured pose no matter what chaos erupted around it. I still drive that route to visit my parents, though now I take the longer way through town after dark, adding 20 minutes but buying peace of mind. Sometimes I wonder about that dog, whether it was stolen from someone's yard, purchased from a sketchy breeder, or raised from birth for this specific purpose. I wonder if those two people are still out there, maybe in another state now, setting up on some other dark highway with their well-trained decoy. But mostly I think about the women who might have stopped before me, the ones who didn't keep their engines running, who trusted their compassion over their instincts, the ones whose families are still searching, still hoping, still checking their phones for a text that says, "Made it home safe." Denver gets quiet when it snows, and that November night was no exception as I walked Cooper through the empty streets near my apartment. My boots crunched against the fresh powder while Cooper, my golden retriever mix, pulled against his leash, nose buried in every interesting smell along Colfax Avenue. I'd moved into the second-floor unit 6 months earlier, right after signing the divorce papers that officially made me single again at 29. The building was one of those converted Victorians from the 1920s, complete with rattling radiators and floors that announced every footstep, but Cooper and I had made it home. That night started like any other. I'd gotten back from my warehouse shift around 9, found Cooper doing his desperate bathroom dance by the door, and bundled up for our usual evening routine. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and thick snowflakes drifted down steadily, muffling the few sounds of passing cars and turning Denver into something from a snow globe. We made our way past the dumpsters behind the building, Cooper taking his time despite my constant shivering, and I remember noticing how untouched everything looked, like nature had thrown a white blanket over the whole neighborhood. After Cooper finished marking his usual spots, we circled back to the front entrance, passing the old fire escape that clung to the side of our building like a skeleton. Snow had accumulated on every step and platform, creating perfect, undisturbed layers that must have been building up for hours. Something caught my eye as I glanced up at my living room window on the second floor. The curtains I always kept closed were parted slightly in the middle, creating a narrow gap where warm light spilled out into the darkness. Strange, I thought, but figured the old radiator must have kicked on and created enough air movement to shift the fabric. Cooper raced up the interior stairwell ahead of me, leaving wet paw prints on the threadbare carpet, while I trudged behind him, feeling every hour of my shift in my lower back. As we approached apartment 2B, I could hear my TV through the door, but something was different about the sound. I distinctly remembered leaving it on ESPN for the Lakers game, but now I was hearing what sounded like a weather report, that droning meteorologist voice talking about storm systems and weekend forecasts. I unlocked the door and Cooper burst inside, immediately heading for his water bowl in the kitchen while I stood in the doorway, staring at the TV. The local news was on, showing some reporter standing in the snow downtown. But I knew for certain I'd been watching basketball before we left. The remote sat on the coffee table exactly where I'd left it, and for a second I wondered if maybe the cable had glitched or the game had ended early. I kicked off my wet boots, hung Cooper's leash on the hook, and walked over to grab the remote, switching back to ESPN where the game was still going, fourth quarter with 5 minutes left. My apartment wasn't much, just a basic one-bedroom with a living room that opened to a tiny kitchen. But I'd gotten used to every sound it made, every way the floorboards creaked, and something felt different that night. The air seemed warmer than it should have been, like the heat had been running longer than the 20 minutes we'd been gone. And there was this smell I couldn't quite place, something like wet wool mixed with stale cigarette smoke. Cooper had finished drinking and was now sniffing around near the coat closet by the front door, his tail low and his body tense in that way dogs get when they sense something wrong. I walked over to pull him away, figuring maybe a mouse had gotten in through the walls again when I heard it. A cough. Not loud, kind of muffled and quick, like someone trying to hold it in, and it came from inside the closet. Every muscle in my body locked up, That primitive freeze response when your brain realizes danger before you fully process what's happening. Cooper started growling, this low rumble I'd never heard from him before, his fur standing up along his spine as he faced the closet door. The blood was pounding so hard in my ears I could barely think straight, but I managed to grab Cooper's collar and slowly back toward my bedroom, trying to remember if I'd left my phone in there or if it was still in my jacket pocket. The closet door was one of those old accordion-style ones that never quite closed right, and through the gap at the bottom, I could see the shadow of feet. Work boots, from what I could tell, sized way bigger than mine, with snow still melting off them, creating small puddles on my hardwood floor. My brain went into this weird overdrive mode, simultaneously screaming at me to run, while also cataloging stupid details like how those puddles were going to warp the wood if they sat there too long. Cooper's growling got louder, more aggressive, and whoever was in that closet shifted their weight, making the door rattle slightly on its track. I kept backing up, pulling Cooper with me, when my hip hit the corner of the kitchen counter and knocked over the ceramic bowl where I kept my keys, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence, and immediately I heard movement from the closet, fast and deliberate, like someone preparing to come out. Without thinking, I yanked Cooper into my bedroom and slammed the door, turning the pathetic little push-button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. My hands were trembling so bad I could barely pull my phone from my jacket pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. While the phone rang, I pressed my ear against the bedroom door and heard heavy footsteps moving through my apartment, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking around like they owned the place. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone had broken into my apartment and was still there, giving my address on Colfax Avenue twice because I was so panicked I wasn't sure if I was making sense. She told me units were on the way, to stay where I was, stay on the line, but all I could focus on was the sound of my kitchen drawers being opened, the metallic sliding noise they made, and knowing exactly which drawer held my kitchen knives. The footsteps moved from the kitchen toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, slow and deliberate, and I could hear this raspy breathing that wasn't mine or Cooper's. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed, a leftover from my softball league days, and positioned myself between Cooper and the door, trying to control my own breathing so I could hear better. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I could barely process them, just kept whispering that he was getting closer. Please hurry, he's right outside my door now. Then the footsteps stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds that felt like hours. There was complete silence except for Cooper's low, continuous growl, and my heart hammering against my ribs. The doorknob rattled just once, a testing kind of turn to see if it was locked, and then I heard him laugh, this quiet, raspy chuckle that made my whole body go cold. Not angry or frustrated, just amused, like this was all some kind of game to him. I heard him walk back down the hallway, and then came sounds I'll never forget. My couch cushions being moved, papers rustling, drawers opening and closing in my living room desk. He was searching for something, or maybe just going through my things because he could, because he'd been in my space while I was gone, and now felt entitled to it. The dispatcher said police were 3 minutes out, but 3 minutes feels like a lifetime when there's only a thin door and a useless lock between you and someone who broke into your home. Through the bedroom window I could see the snow still falling steadily, the fire escape outside covered in white, just like I'd seen it from the ground, except now I realized those perfect, undisturbed layers I'd noticed earlier had been a lie. He must have brushed the snow back into place after climbing up, covering his tracks, which meant he'd put thought into this, planned it, watched me leave with Cooper before making his move. Suddenly I heard sirens in the distance getting louder, and the sounds from my living room stopped immediately. Fast footsteps crossed my apartment, and I heard my front door slam open so hard it hit the wall. I stayed frozen in place, bat still raised, Cooper pressed against my legs, listening to those heavy boots running down the interior stairs. The dispatcher was saying something, but I couldn't focus on her words. just waited until the sirens were right outside my building before I finally unlocked my bedroom door with shaking fingers. My apartment looked like a tornado had gone through it. Every drawer pulled out, cushions thrown around, papers scattered across the floor. The closet door hung open, and inside I could see where he'd pushed aside my coats to hide, the hangers still swaying slightly. There were wet boot prints everywhere, leading from the window to the closet, then throughout my apartment, and finally out the front door that still stood wide open. 2 cops showed up first, both younger guys who seemed almost as nervous as I was, followed by an older detective who took one look at the scene and immediately called for the crime scene unit. They found where he'd jimmied my living room window from the fire escape, the lock completely broken, wood splintered around the frame. The detective, a woman named Reeves who had this calming way of talking, explained that there'd been a string of similar break-ins in the neighborhood, always during snowstorms when footprints would be covered quickly, always targeting second-floor apartments with fire escape access. What made me different, she said, was that I'd come home while he was still there. The others had been out for hours, returning to find their places ransacked. They collected fingerprints from the window frame and closet door, took photos of the boot prints before they dried completely, and had me walk through to see if anything was missing. My laptop was still there, my TV, even the cash I'd left on my dresser, which made everything worse somehow, knowing he wasn't after my things but something else, maybe just the thrill of being in someone else's space. Detective Reeves found something I hadn't noticed in my panic, a half-eaten sandwich on my kitchen counter, made with my bread, my turkey, my mustard, with a bite taken out of it like he'd been having a casual lunch. Next to it was an open beer from my fridge, mostly empty, condensation still beading on the bottle. The violation of it hit me harder than the ransacked drawers. This person had made themselves at home, eaten my food, drank my beer, probably sat on my couch and watched my TV while I was walking Cooper in the snow. She bagged everything for evidence and mentioned they'd found similar scenes at other break-ins. The intruder always helping himself to food, always leaving that signature half-eaten meal behind like some kind of calling card. Cooper hadn't left my side since the police arrived, pressing against my legs whenever anyone moved too suddenly, and I knew he'd sensed the danger before I had. Tried to warn me with his body language that something was wrong with that closet. They caught him 5 days later, trying the same thing 3 blocks away at another Victorian conversion. The homeowner had installed a security camera after hearing about the break-ins, and it caught him clear as day, climbing the fire escape during another snowstorm. Gregory Watts was his name, 43 years old, had been living in his car since getting evicted 6 months earlier. Detective Reeves called to tell me they'd found items from all the break-ins in his car, including a notebook where he'd written down addresses, schedules, details about the residents. My entry was there. 2B Colfax, single male, dog, walks 9:30 p.m. most nights, works late shift. He'd been watching us for weeks, learning our routine, waiting for the perfect snowy night. The court gave him 18 months and I got a victim notification letter saying he'd be eligible for parole in 9. I moved out the next month, found a place on the ground floor with better locks and no fire escape, though Cooper and I still do our evening walks. But even now, whenever it snows, whenever I come back to find something slightly out of place, a curtain shifted, or a cushion moved, I think about that cough from the closet and check every door, every window, every hiding spot before I can breathe normally again. The week after Halloween always feels strange in our neighborhood, like the whole street is recovering from a sugar hangover, and that Monday in 2018 was no different. I'd just gotten my daughter Chloe to bed around 8:30, which was a miracle considering she was still wired from all the leftover candy I'd stupidly let her have after dinner. Being 33 with a 6-year-old meant most of my evenings looked exactly like this one. Kitchen cleanup, lunch prep for tomorrow, and if I was lucky, maybe 45 minutes of whatever show I was binging before passing out on the couch. We lived in this little ranch-style house just outside Jefferson City. Nothing fancy, but it had a good school district and a big backyard where Chloe could play. The divorce had been finalized that spring, and honestly, those first few months of just the two of us had been harder than I'd expected. But by November, we'd found our rhythm. Around 9:30, right as I was folding the last of Chloe's school uniforms, the doorbell rang. Now, nobody ever came to our door that late on a Monday, especially not in early November when it got dark by 6 and the temperature dropped into the 40s. Through the peephole, I could see two figures in dark hoodies standing on my porch, both probably teenagers from their height and build, though I couldn't make out their faces with the hoods up. They were whispering to each other and giggling, that nervous kind of laugh kids do when they're pulling a prank. I figured they were doing some late trick-or-treating dare, or maybe had lost a bet with their friends. Without opening the door, I flicked the porch light on and off twice, my universal signal for nobody's buying what you're selling, and watched through the side window as they looked at each other, laughed harder, then jogged down my driveway and disappeared into the darkness of the street. I went back to the laundry, but something kept nagging at me about the whole thing. Maybe it was how they'd stood there. Not quite right. Like when you see someone in a play trying too hard to act natural. The taller one had kept his head tilted down the entire time, and the shorter one's giggle had this weird rhythm to it, almost mechanical, like he was forcing it out at regular intervals. But I brushed it off because, honestly, teenagers are weird, and after teaching 3rd grade for 5 years before having Chloe, I'd seen kids do stranger things for attention. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, checked that the front door was locked, twice actually, and settled into the living room with my laptop to finish some lesson plans for my online tutoring students. 10 minutes later, I heard it. A soft tapping on glass, deliberate and spaced out perfectly. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The sound was coming from the back of the house, from the sliding glass door that opened onto our deck. My whole body went rigid in that awful way where you want to move but can't quite get your muscles to cooperate. The tapping continued, patient and steady, and I could picture someone standing out there in the darkness of my backyard, knuckles against the glass, waiting. The motion sensor light back there had been broken since September. I'd been meaning to fix it but kept putting it off, so whoever was out there was doing this in complete darkness. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, staying low, keeping away from the direct line of sight to that glass door. From where I crouched behind the kitchen island, I could barely make out a shape through the glass door, just a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter darkness of the yard beyond. It wasn't moving, just standing there, one arm raised like it was about to knock again. The figure seemed taller than I remembered either of those kids being, but maybe it was just the angle, or maybe one was standing on my deck furniture. I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. What would I even say? That someone knocked on my door and now they're in my backyard. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. Lower on the door, like whoever was out there had knelt down or bent over. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten. The subtle rattle of the door handle being tested, gentle at first, then a bit more insistent when it didn't budge. My phone screen lit up my face in the darkness, and I swear the silhouette outside shifted, like it had noticed the glow. I held my breath and watched as the shape moved sideways along the glass, disappearing from view, and for maybe 20 seconds, there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then came a scraping sound from the other side of the house, metal on wood, and I realized with horrible clarity what was happening. They were checking the windows. The scraping moved from the guest bedroom window to the bathroom, getting closer to Chloe's room. That broke my paralysis completely. I hit call on 911 and stood up, not caring anymore if they saw me because nobody was getting near my daughter's window, not while I was conscious and breathing. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I whispered as clearly as I could that someone was trying to break into my house, gave her my address, and told her my 6-year-old was asleep in her room. She kept me on the line, saying units were on their way, maybe 5 minutes out, and to stay away from windows and doors. But I was already moving down the hallway toward Chloe's room, phone pressed to my ear, when I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter from outside her window, that same mechanical giggling from earlier, but now it was accompanied by a second voice, deeper, definitely adult, muttering something I couldn't make out. Through the thin curtains of Chloe's room, I could see the shadows of 2 figures right outside, and one of them was doing something to the window screen, pulling at the corner where it met the frame. I burst into Chloe's room and scooped her up while she was still half asleep, blanket and all, and carried her into my bedroom closet on the opposite side of the house. She mumbled something about a bad dream, and I whispered that we were playing a hiding game, that she needed to be super quiet like when we play hide and seek. My beautiful, trusting daughter just nodded against my shoulder and closed her eyes again. The dispatcher was still talking, but I could barely focus on her words because now I could hear them at the front door again. Not knocking this time, but doing something to the lock. A metallic scratching sound that went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then suddenly silence. Complete, total silence. Even the dispatcher seemed to sense it because she stopped asking questions and just said, "Officers are 2 minutes out, stay where you are." We sat in that closet, Chloe breathing softly against my neck, me trying not to hyperventilate, surrounded by the smell of my winter coats and old shoes. Then I heard something that to this day makes me nauseous when I think about it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, careful footsteps directly above us, moving from the edge toward the center of the house. Our attic access was in the hallway ceiling, just a simple pull-down panel with a folding ladder, and I'd never even thought to check if it locked from the inside. The footsteps stopped right about where that panel would be, and I heard a creaking sound, the kind old wood makes when weight shifts on it. The dispatcher must have heard my breathing change because she whispered that officers were pulling onto my street now, 30 seconds away. The sirens came before the footsteps could move again, and immediately the sounds on the roof turned into scrambling, running, like squirrels but heavier, moving fast toward the back of the house. I heard a thump that must have been someone jumping down, maybe onto the deck, and then nothing. The dispatcher told me to stay put until the officers cleared the scene, and I held Chloe tighter, feeling her little heartbeat against mine. When the police finally gave the all clear and I carried Chloe back to her bed, she was completely asleep, unaware of how close we'd come to something terrible. The officers found footprints in the flower bed below her window. The screen had been cut with what looked like a box cutter, and there were scratch marks on the front door lock, like someone had tried to pick it with amateur tools. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The reason I'm sharing this story now, years later, after we've moved to a different state entirely. The next morning, one of the officers came back with a detective, and they asked to see my security camera footage. I'd forgotten about the camera completely. My ex had installed this cheap wireless one by the front door the previous year, and honestly, I rarely checked it. We pulled up the app on my phone and scrolled back to the night before, and what we saw made the detective immediately call for additional units. The first person at my door, the shorter one I'd thought was a teenager, was wearing what looked like a rubber Halloween mask, one of those old man ones with wrinkled skin and wispy gray hair. But it was the taller figure that made everyone in the room go quiet. It was definitely an adult man, probably in his 40s, wearing a teenager's face mask, the kind that just covers the front of your face with elastic bands. The video showed him pulling something from his pocket while the other one rang the doorbell. It was a roll of duct tape. The detective told me they'd been tracking similar attempts in 3 other neighborhoods around Jefferson City that week, always targeting single mothers, always using the same method of sending the masked decoy to the front while the man tried to find another way in. They caught them 2 days later trying the same thing at a house in Fulton, about 20 miles away. The man turned out to be a registered sex offender from Arkansas who'd been violating his parole. and his accomplice was his 19-year-old nephew who he'd convinced to help him. When they searched the man's van, they found zip ties, tape, rope, and a journal with addresses and notes about the routines of different women and their children. My address was in there, along with notes about what time I usually turned off the lights when I left for work, and that I had a young daughter who went to Riverside Elementary. They'd been watching us for at least 2 weeks before that night. I testified at the trial, and he got 25 years. We moved the following summer, and even now, whenever someone knocks on my door after dark, even when I'm expecting them, I check every window and door twice before I go to bed. November always felt heavy in our town, like the air itself was tired from holding up all that gray sky. I'd just turned 17 that September, same week I got my learner's permit, and everything about that fall felt like waiting for something to start. My best friends Garrett and Jenna lived on the same cul-de-sac as me, had since we were in elementary school, and we did everything together. That Saturday night, first weekend of November, the Andersons down on Birchwood were throwing their annual post-Halloween bonfire, the one where everyone brought their leftover candy, and Mr. Anderson told the same ghost stories he'd been telling since we were kids. We went every year, mostly for the tradition now, watching the younger kids jump at the scary parts while we roasted marshmallows and talked about college applications. The fire was dying down around 11 when we decided to walk home, taking the long way through the neighborhood, because none of us wanted the night to end yet. The streets were empty except for a few porch lights and the occasional jack-o'-lantern still glowing on someone's steps, most of them already soft and caving in on themselves. Garrett was doing his terrible impression of Mr. Anderson's voice, making Jenna laugh so hard she had to stop walking, and I remember thinking how perfect everything felt, how these were the moments I'd miss next year when we were all at different schools. We were about 4 blocks from the bonfire when I noticed the van for the first time, this dingy white panel van with rust eating through the wheel wells, crawling along behind us maybe 50 feet back. The weird thing was how it would slow down every time we passed under a streetlight, like the driver was trying to get a better look at us, then speed up slightly in the dark patches between. Garrett was still goofing around, hadn't noticed anything, but Jenna caught my eye and I could tell she'd seen it too, the way her shoulders got tight and she moved a little closer to us. Tried to keep my voice casual when I suggested we cut through the park, thinking maybe the van was just heading the same direction by coincidence. But when we turned onto Sycamore, the van turned too, keeping that same creepy distance. The engine made this low, rumbling sound, not quite healthy, like something was loose under the hood, and I could hear it getting louder and softer as the driver played with the gas pedal. Jenna grabbed my arm then, her fingers digging in through my jacket, and whispered that we should call someone. But who were we going to call? Our parents would freak out, maybe ground us for walking home so late, and we weren't even sure if anything was really wrong yet. The van had tinted windows in the back, completely dark, and the front windshield reflected the streetlights in a way that made it impossible to see who was driving. Garrett finally caught on that something was happening, stopped his joking mid-sentence when he turned and saw the van rolling along behind us. No headlights on now, just these dim orange running lights that made it look like some kind of predator with glowing eyes. We started walking faster without really discussing it, our sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk in this awkward rhythm as we tried not to run but couldn't help speeding up. The van sped up too, engine growling louder, and then did something that made my whole body go rigid with fear. It pulled ahead of us suddenly, maybe 100 feet, and turned into a driveway on the right side of the street, killing all its lights completely. The house it had pulled into was dark, no cars in the driveway except for the van now, and I knew the family that lived there, the Carters, had gone to Florida for a week because their daughter was in my chemistry class, and she'd been complaining about missing the bonfire. The van just sat there in the shadows next to their garage, engine ticking as it cooled, waiting for us to walk past. We stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, the three of us breathing hard even though we hadn't been running yet. and I could hear Jenna's teeth chattering, even though it wasn't that cold. Garrett suggested we cross the street and go back the way we came. But before we could move, the van's reverse lights flashed on, these harsh white rectangles in the darkness, and it started backing out of the driveway, slow and deliberate. The driver had turned the engine back on but kept the headlights off, and the van was rolling backward down the street toward us, weaving slightly like the driver was watching us in the side mirror instead of looking where they were going. That's when we ran, all three of us at the same time, no discussion needed, just pure instinct taking over. We cut hard left through someone's yard, my foot catching on a garden hose and nearly sending me face first into their lawn gnome collection, Jenna pulling me up by my elbow as we scrambled between two houses. Behind us, I could hear the van's engine roar as it accelerated, tires squealing as it tried to turn around in the narrow street, and then the sound of a car door slamming that sent ice through my veins. We burst into the backyard of a house I didn't recognize, motion sensor floods blazing to life and lighting us up like we were on stage, and Garrett was already pulling out his phone, his hands fumbling with the passcode. The backyard connected to another street through a gap in the fence, and we squeezed through, splinters from the old wood catching on our clothes, ripping Jenna's jacket sleeve. I could taste copper in my mouth from running so hard, and my legs felt disconnected from my body, like they belonged to someone else who just happened to be carrying me along. We were on Oakmont now, at least 6 blocks from where the van had been, and Garrett finally got through to 911, practically shouting our location into the phone while we crouched behind someone's SUV. The operator kept asking him to slow down, to explain what was happening. But how could we explain something that sounded so paranoid when you said it out loud? A van was following us. The driver turned around to chase us. We were hiding now behind a random car, praying the van wouldn't cruise down this street next. The police showed up faster than I expected, 2 cruisers with their lights on but no sirens, and the officers separated us to get our stories while we stood there in the middle of Oakmont, looking like we'd been through a hurricane. My officer, this older guy with a thick gray mustache who introduced himself as Officer Brennan, actually believed us right away, didn't give us any grief about being out late or suggest we were imagining things. He radioed the description of the van to other units, then drove us around the neighborhood in the back of his cruiser, asking us to point out exactly where everything had happened. When we got to the Carter house where the van had pulled in, there were fresh tire marks in the driveway, deep grooves in the gravel where it had reversed hard, and Officer Brennan took photos with his phone, measured the wheelbase with a tape measure from his trunk. He said something into his radio about checking camera footage from the ATM at the bank on Sycamore, which would have captured any vehicle passing that intersection. About an hour later, while we were sitting in the police station waiting for our parents and drinking hot chocolate that tasted like chalk, Officer Brennan came back with this expression on his face that made my chest tighten all over again. They'd found the van, he said, abandoned in the parking lot of Westfield Middle School, still warm, driver's door hanging open. The weird part was what they found inside. 3 rolls of duct tape, a box of zip ties, and a notebook with addresses written in it, including several houses in our neighborhood with the days and times written next to them. The Carter house was on the list with "out of town" written beside it, and there were notes about 3 targets, with descriptions that matched me, Garrett, and Jenna pretty well, down to Jenna's purple backpack and Garrett's varsity jacket. The van had been reported stolen from a plumbing company 2 towns over 3 days earlier, and they never found who'd been driving it that night, despite pulling prints and checking every security camera they could find. Our parents went into full protective mode after that, driving us everywhere for weeks, installing new security systems, organizing neighborhood watch meetings that packed the community center. The detective assigned to our case, a woman named Diane Lawson who wore these thick-rimmed glasses and always had a coffee stain somewhere on her shirt, told us we'd likely been watched for days, maybe weeks, that whoever was in that van had been planning something specific. She showed us footage from the bank ATM that caught the van passing by earlier that evening, before the bonfire even started, just circling the neighborhood in slow loops. You could make out a figure in the driver's seat, baseball cap pulled low, but the quality was too grainy to get any real details. The notebook had our routines written down: when we walked to school, when we stayed after for clubs, when we typically hung out at the park on weekends, and Detective Lawson said we were lucky we'd varied our pattern that night by going to the bonfire. The middle school where they found the van had security cameras too, but whoever ditched it there knew exactly where the blind spots were, parking in the one corner where 3 broken cameras created a perfect dead zone. The only glimpse they got was a figure in dark clothes walking quickly away from the van, heading toward the tree line at the back of the school property. And by the time the K-9 unit arrived, the trail had gone cold at the creek that ran behind the playground. What haunted me most were the small details the detective mentioned almost offhandedly. Fresh scratches on the inside of the van's rear doors, like someone had been testing the locks from inside, and a receipt from a hardware store dated that morning for the zip ties and tape, paid in cash at a store 40 miles away. Whoever it was had driven 40 miles just to buy those supplies where no one would recognize them, then driven back to hunt us. For weeks after that night, every white van made me stop breathing for a second. Every stranger who looked at us a beat too long made my skin prickle with that same fear. Jenna started carrying pepper spray and taking a different route home every day. Never the same pattern twice. And Garrett's older brother started picking him up from school in his pickup truck, wouldn't let him walk anywhere alone. The police increased patrols in our neighborhood, and for about a month there was always a cruiser parked near the school, or doing slow loops through our streets. But eventually, things went back to normal, at least on the surface. Detective Lawson called us in December to say they'd connected our case to 2 similar incidents in neighboring counties. Same pattern with the white van and the notebook. But those kids hadn't been as lucky as us, hadn't run fast enough, though she wouldn't give us details about what had happened to them. The case never got solved, at least not while we were still in high school, and by the time I left for college the following year, it had become just another unsolved mystery in the filing cabinets at the police station. Sometimes I Google it, looking for updates or similar cases, wondering if whoever was in that van that night ever got caught somewhere else, but I never find anything definitive. What I can't forget is that moment when the van reversed toward us in the dark, how deliberate it was, how patient they'd been watching us for weeks, learning our habits and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Jenna, Garrett, and I are still close, even though we're spread across different states now. And every November when we text each other around the anniversary, none of us mentions it directly, but we all know what we're really checking on, making sure we're all still okay, still here, still running faster than whatever was chasing us that night. Snow was coming to Plattsburgh that Monday, and I could smell it in the air when I stepped onto my porch with my morning coffee. After 26 years of marriage to Nathan, I'd gotten pretty good at reading warning signs, though apparently not good enough to avoid the October divorce that left me starting over in a duplex that smelled like old wood and whatever the previous tenant had been cooking for the past decade. Frank, my elderly landlord who lived in the other half, had promised quick maintenance response times, which mattered since teaching 7th grade. Math didn't leave me much energy for home repairs. The place had its charm, though, with original hardwood floors and tall windows that actually opened, unlike the sealed disasters in most modern apartments. I'd been there exactly 9 days, still discovering which floorboards creaked and which light switches controlled what. That morning started like the others since I'd moved in, except for the weather forecast promising 6 to 8 inches by nightfall. I stood in my living room, watching the sky turn that sick yellow color that precedes every upstate storm, when I heard this weird scraping noise from below. Real faint, almost like fingernails on concrete, but steady and deliberate. I got down on the floor, pressed my ear against the cold wood and listened. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, paused, then started again. The heating had just kicked on, so I figured it was probably the old pipes doing their thing, or maybe Frank was organizing something in our shared basement. He'd mentioned he kept holiday decorations down there. I finished my coffee, grabbed my stack of ungraded tests, and drove to school through streets that were already emptying out in anticipation of the storm. School let out early at 1:30 because of the weather, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, thick flakes were already coating everything. Frank's car was gone, which wasn't unusual since he mentioned he spent Mondays at his daughter's place in Malone, about an hour west. I brought in an armload of firewood from the covered pile out back, thinking I'd grade papers by the fireplace and enjoy my first real snow day in the new place. But when I walked through the front door, I noticed something immediately wrong. My living room rug, this cheap burgundy thing I'd bought at Target the previous week, was pushed up at one corner, like someone had tripped over it. I specifically remembered straightening it that morning after catching my toe on the edge, and there was this smell, really subtle but definitely there, like unwashed clothes mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The scraping sound started again while I was standing there with my arms full of firewood, and this time it was louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from directly beneath the living room, right under where I was standing. I dropped the wood on the couch and went to the basement door in the kitchen, flipping on the light switch at the top of the stairs. The single bulb down there barely illuminated anything beyond the wooden steps. I called out, asking if Frank was down there, even though I knew his car was gone. No response, but the scraping stopped immediately, like whatever was making the noise had heard me. I stood there at the top of those stairs for probably a full minute, listening to nothing but my own breathing and the tick of snow hitting the kitchen windows. Every instinct told me not to go down there alone, but I kept thinking about how Frank would react if I called him at his daughter's house over what was probably just a raccoon or some pipes that needed adjusting. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and made my way down, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house this old. Stone foundation walls, exposed ceiling joists covered in cobwebs, and that damp earth smell that never quite goes away. Frank's half was sectioned off with a piece of plywood, and there were a few cardboard boxes labeled Xmas and Easter stacked against the divider. My side was mostly empty except for the furnace, water heater, and some old shelving units the previous tenant had left behind. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, looking for any signs of animals or water damage that might explain the noise. That's when I noticed the coal chute door in the far corner, something I hadn't even known existed until that moment. These old houses used to get coal deliveries straight into the basement, and most people just sealed them up decades ago when they converted to gas or oil heat. But this one wasn't sealed anymore. The metal door, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, was hanging open about 6 inches, and there were fresh scratch marks on the concrete floor leading from it toward the center of the basement. I walked closer, my flashlight beam shaking slightly, and that's when the smell hit me full force. Body odor, stale food, and something sickly sweet like overripe fruit. I pulled the door open wider and aimed my light inside. There was a blue sleeping bag, one of those cheap Coleman ones you can get at any sporting goods store, spread out in the crawl space beyond the chute. Empty Chef Boyardee cans were stacked neatly against one wall, along with water bottles, some still half full. But the thing that made my chest go tight was the phone charger plugged into my outlet, the cord snaking back through the opening to a spot I couldn't see. Someone had been living in my basement, probably had been there before I even moved in, and they were still coming and going through that old coal chute that opened up near the bushes on the side of my house. I backed away from the coal chute so fast I knocked over one of the empty shelving units, the metal crash echoing through the basement. My phone was upstairs, and suddenly that seemed like the stupidest thing in the world, coming down here without it. Turned to run back up the stairs and saw something that made me stop cold. There were footprints in the dust on the concrete floor, fresh ones that weren't mine, leading from the coal chute to the stairs. Not just one set either, but multiple tracks going back and forth, some of them made by bare feet. The most recent one, still sharp and clear in the dust, went right up to the basement door I'd just come through. This person, whoever they were, had been walking through my kitchen, my living room, probably standing right behind me while I slept on the couch that first week after moving in, too exhausted to make it to my bedroom. I ran up those stairs faster than I'd moved in years, slammed the basement door behind me, and dragged a kitchen chair under the doorknob. My phone was on the counter, and I called 911 with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. While I waited for the police, I stood at my front window watching the snow pile up, wondering if whoever had been living beneath my floors was out there somewhere, watching me back. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking me questions I could barely answer because I kept thinking about all those nights I'd heard the house settling. All those mornings I'd found things slightly out of place and blamed my post-divorce brain fog. The woman on the phone kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were on their way. But the snow was coming down harder now, and I knew the roads would slow them down. 20 minutes, she said, maybe 30 with the weather. I moved every piece of furniture I could lift in front of the basement door, creating a barricade that would at least make noise if someone tried to come through. The wait felt like hours, but it was probably only 15 minutes before I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The scraping sound again, but this time it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from outside, near the living room window, like metal against wood. I crept to the window, staying low, and peeked through the blinds. There was a man out there, skinny and hunched over, wearing a filthy green army jacket that was way too big for him. He had stringy gray hair that hung past his shoulders, and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. He was using something, maybe a screwdriver or a knife, trying to pry open my window from the outside. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely make out his features, but I could see his lips moving like he was talking to himself, and his breath came out in quick white puffs that disappeared into the storm. When he looked up, maybe sensing me watching, his eyes met mine through the gap in the blinds, and they were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white, like a husky dog's eyes. He didn't run when he saw me. He just stood there, still gripping whatever tool he'd been using, snow accumulating on his shoulders and in his tangled hair. Then he smiled, not a normal smile, but something that showed too many teeth, yellowed and broken, and he pressed his face right up against the glass. I could see dirt caked under his fingernails as he tapped on the window, 3 soft knocks like he was visiting a friend. The dispatcher was asking what was happening, but I couldn't form words. The man outside tilted his head, studying me like I was something fascinating he'd discovered, and then he spoke loud enough for me to hear through the glass. He said my name, my actual first name, clear as day. Not yelling, not threatening, just conversational, like we were old acquaintances. He knew who I was. He'd probably gone through my mail, my papers, everything I'd thrown away since moving in. He knew my schedule, when I left for work, when I came home. He'd been living underneath me, learning me, and now with the police still minutes away and the snow creating a white wall around my house, he wanted me to know that he knew. I screamed at him to get away, that the police were coming, and that seemed to amuse him because he actually laughed, this wet, rattling sound that I could hear even through the window. Then he held up something in his other hand, and it took me a second to realize what it was. My spare house key, the one I'd hidden under a decorative rock by the back door my second day there. He dangled it between his thumb and finger, making sure I could see it clearly through the falling snow, and then he walked away from the window, disappearing around the corner of the house. The dispatcher was practically yelling at me now, telling me to get to a room with a lock to barricade myself in, but all I could think about was that he had a key, had probably always had it, and every night I'd locked my doors thinking I was safe. He could have walked right in whenever he wanted. I ran to my bedroom, slammed the door, and shoved my dresser in front of it, the wood scraping across the floor just like the sound I'd been hearing from the basement. I could hear him now, the front door opening. Not forced, not broken, just the normal sound of a key turning in a lock and the door swinging open on its hinges. His footsteps were slow and deliberate on the hardwood, and he was humming something, some tune I didn't recognize. The dispatcher said the police were 3 minutes out, maybe less, but I could hear him in my kitchen now, opening drawers, looking for something. Then the footsteps came toward the bedroom, and he knocked on the door, polite as could be, and asked if I wanted to talk about the rent. The rent, like he owned the place, like I was the intruder. He said Frank had promised him he could stay, that they had an arrangement, that I wasn't supposed to be here yet. His voice was calm, reasonable even, which made it so much worse. He said he'd been waiting for the right time to introduce himself, that he didn't mean to scare me, that we could share the space if I wanted. The dresser shook as he tested the door, and I could see the wood starting to splinter near the lock. Then the sirens cut through everything, that beautiful wailing sound getting louder every second. The pressure on my bedroom door stopped immediately, and I heard his footsteps retreat fast across the living room. The front door slammed, and through my bedroom window I watched him sprint through the snow toward the tree line behind the house, that oversized army jacket flapping behind him like wings. The police found me still barricaded in my bedroom, and it took 3 officers to convince me it was safe to move the dresser. They searched the basement, documented everything. The sleeping bag, the food, a notebook filled with observations about my daily routine written in pencil, even sketches of me sleeping on the couch. They found where he'd been getting in and out through the coal chute, the outside opening hidden behind an overgrown juniper bush that Frank apparently hadn't trimmed in years. The man's name was Howard Pelletier, a local who'd been in and out of psychiatric facilities for decades. Frank's nephew recognized him from the description and said Howard used to do odd jobs for Frank years ago, back before his mental health completely deteriorated. They never caught him that night. The snow covered his tracks within an hour, and he knew those woods better than anyone. But they boarded up the coal chute, changed all my locks, and a patrol car sat outside my duplex for the next 3 nights. I moved out the following week, stayed with my sister in Albany until I found a new place, this time a modern apartment on the 3rd floor with proper locks and a security system. Frank tried to keep my security deposit, said I broke the lease, but I had a lawyer friend write him a letter that changed his mind real quick. I heard from another teacher months later that Howard turned up at a homeless shelter in Burlington when the weather got bad in January. The police arrested him there, and he went back to a psychiatric facility, though for how long I never found out. I still teach at the same school, still grade papers in the evening, but now I live in a place where every sound has an explanation, where footsteps belong to neighbors I know by name, and where the only thing under my floor is another apartment with a young couple who play their music too loud on weekends. And that's fine by me. The cold had teeth that November night in Alaska, the kind that bites through 3 layers of clothing and makes your bones ache. I'd been hauling frozen seafood from Anchorage down to Fairbanks for about 6 years by then, enough runs to know every pothole and curve on the park's highway. My rig, a beat-up Peterbilt that had seen better days sometime during the Clinton administration, was parked at a pull-off near mile marker 147, one of those spots truckers use when the official rest areas are full or too far away. The heater was running on low, just enough to keep the frost from forming inside the windshield, and I'd wedged myself into the sleeper cab with my usual setup. Sleeping bag rated for -40, wool socks doubled up, and my phone charging on the little shelf I'd installed myself. Outside, the darkness was absolute, that special kind of black you only get when you're 50 miles from the nearest town, and the clouds are covering whatever stars might be brave enough to shine. I remember checking my watch right before falling asleep, one of those habits you develop when your life revolves around delivery schedules and hours of service regulations. The green digits showed 9:47 p.m., which meant I could get a solid 6 hours before I needed to start rolling again to make my morning drop-off. The last thing I heard was the tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling down, metal contracting in the cold, a sound as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Sleep came easy that night, the exhaustion of 14 hours on icy roads pulling me under like quicksand. I'd parked here probably 30 times before, always the same spot where the ground was level enough that I wouldn't wake up with a crick in my neck from sleeping at an angle. Other truckers knew about this place too, but tonight I was alone, just my rig and the occasional groan of wind pushing against the trailer. The knocking started at 1:14 a.m. according to that same watch when I jolted awake. 3 measured raps on the driver's side window, not frantic but deliberate, like someone calmly trying to get your attention at a store counter. My first thought was another trucker, maybe somebody who'd blown a tire or needed jumper cables. Happens more than you'd think out here. I sat up in the dark, my breath fogging in the cold air, and fumbled for the little LED flashlight I keep velcroed to the wall. The knocking came again, same pattern. 3 steady knocks that echoed hollow against the glass. Through the sleeper cab's small window, I could barely make out a shape standing beside my door, just a dark outline against the darker night. The person stepped back when they saw me moving, giving me room to climb forward into the driver's seat. When I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it through the window, the beam lit up a man's face that I'll never forget, not because it was scary or deformed or anything like that, but because it was so perfectly ordinary except for one detail. He was sweating. Here was this guy, standing in -20 weather wearing just a flannel shirt and jeans. No coat, no gloves, and there were actual beads of sweat running down his forehead. He had sandy hair cut short, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven. The kind of face you'd see at any hardware store or gas station and forget 5 minutes later. But that sweat, it was wrong, like seeing someone sunbathing in a blizzard. He smiled when the light hit him, raised his hand in a little wave and mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass. I cracked the window maybe 2 inches, keeping my hand on the gear shift out of habit, ready to fire up the engine if needed. "Hey there, friend," he said, and his voice was steady, casual, like we were meeting at a barbecue instead of a frozen pull-off in the middle of nowhere. "Sorry to wake you, but my car died about a quarter mile back, just around that curve. Battery's fine, engine turns over, but she won't catch. Think it might be the fuel line freezing up. Happens all the time up here, right?" He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and I watched the sweat immediately freeze into tiny crystals on his skin. "I was wondering if you could help me push it, get it rolling downhill a bit. Sometimes that's all it takes to get the fuel flowing again. 2 strong guys like us shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." His eyes never left mine the whole time he talked, not blinking much, just steady eye contact that felt rehearsed somehow. The thing about truckers is we help each other out. It's an unwritten rule of the road. I've changed more tires and given more jump starts than I can count, pulled guys out of ditches, shared food when somebody's broke down waiting for a tow. But every instinct I'd developed in 20 years of driving was screaming at me that something was wrong with this picture. Beyond the sweat, beyond the lack of winter clothes, there was the timing. He said his car was a quarter mile back, but I'd been asleep for over 3 hours and hadn't heard any vehicle pass by. And trust me, you hear everything in a quiet night like that. The gravel crunches, the engine noise carries, especially around curves where people tap their brakes. Plus, if his car really wouldn't start, how was pushing it going to help with a frozen fuel line? That's not how engines work, and anybody who drives in Alaska knows that. "Where's your coat?" I asked through the crack in the window, watching my breath turn to ice crystals in the air between us. The question seemed to catch him off guard for just a second, his smile flickering like a TV losing signal, before coming back full strength. "Left it in the car," he said, laughing a little. "Stupid, I know, but I was so frustrated when she died that I just started walking. Figured I'd find help quick. Been walking for maybe 20 minutes now, worked up quite a sweat actually. Come on, man. I'm freezing out here despite how it looks. My wife's gonna kill me if I don't make it home tonight. Got my daughter's recital tomorrow. She's playing violin, first chair." He pulled out a wallet, started showing me a photo through the window. But in the dark, with just my flashlight, all I could see was the reflection on the plastic sleeve. I kept the window cracked, but didn't move to open the door, and I could see his patience starting to wear thin. Though he tried to hide it, his jaw muscles tightened just a bit, and he shifted his weight from foot to foot, not like someone cold, but like someone getting ready for something. "Tell you what," I said, trying to sound helpful. "Let me call you a tow truck. I've got good cell signal here, and there's a 24-hour service out of Cantwell. They could be here in maybe an hour." I reached for my phone, making a show of it, but kept my eyes on him. That's when his whole demeanor changed, like dropping a mask. The friendly smile disappeared, replaced by something flat and calculating. "No need for that," he said, his voice different now, lower, more insistent. "Just need you to step out for 5 minutes. Your truck will be fine, I promise. Just need some help pushing, that's all." That's when I saw it, just a glimpse in my side mirror, movement behind my trailer, maybe 30 feet back. Another person trying to stay in the shadows, moving slowly along the passenger side of my rig. The man at my window must have seen my eyes flick to the mirror because he immediately knocked harder, trying to get my attention back. "Hey, come on, buddy, don't leave me hanging here. Alaska rules, right? We help each other out." His hand went to his pocket, and I didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. I cranked the engine, and the Peterbilt roared to life, diesel smoke billowing black in the cold air. The man jumped back from the door, and in my passenger mirror, I saw the second person sprint away from my truck, heading for the tree line. I slammed the truck into gear and hit the air release, the brakes hissing like angry snakes. The man was shouting something now, but I couldn't hear it over the engine noise, didn't want to hear it. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the pull-off, and that's when I saw their vehicle, tucked behind a cluster of spruce trees where I hadn't noticed it before. A dark pickup truck with the engine running, exhaust visible in the cold. A third person sitting in the driver's seat. No broken down car, no mechanical trouble, just 3 people who'd been waiting in the dark for someone to stop. I gunned it onto the highway, checking my mirrors constantly for the next 10 miles, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My CB radio was crackling with static, and with shaking fingers I switched to Channel 19, the truckers' channel, to warn anyone else who might be heading that way. The chatter on the CB that night is what really made everything sink in. About 40 minutes after I'd gotten back on the road, still jumpy at every set of headlights in my mirrors, I heard another driver, handle was Kodiak Bear, talking about something that happened at the Broad Pass rest area, maybe 15 miles from where I'd been parked. A driver had stopped to use the facilities, left his rig running like we all do in winter to keep the diesel from gelling, came back to find 2 men inside his cab. They'd beaten him pretty bad when he tried to stop them, left him on the ground with a concussion and broken ribs while they took off with his truck and $50,000 worth of electronics he'd been hauling to Fairbanks. The state troopers found the truck 6 hours later, abandoned and stripped clean off a logging road. Kodiak Bear said the driver was lucky to be alive, that the temperature had dropped to -30 that night, and if another trucker hadn't found him 20 minutes later, he would have frozen to death right there in that rest area parking lot. I made my delivery in Fairbanks the next morning. Barely slept for the next 3 nights, kept seeing that sweating face at my window every time I closed my eyes. Filed a report with the troopers, described everything I could remember. But they said, without a license plate or better description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. The officer I talked to, a woman who'd been working the highways for 15 years, told me I'd probably saved my own life by trusting my instincts. She said these kinds of setups were getting more common, groups targeting long-haul truckers because we often carry valuable cargo and always have diesel fuel, which sells good on the black market. The sweat on that man's face still bothers me when I think about it, and I finally figured out why he was sweating in that cold. Adrenaline, pure and simple. He was pumped up for violence, ready to do whatever it took to get me out of that cab. Now I sleep with a crowbar next to my bed in the sleeper, and I never crack my window for anyone at night, no matter how legitimate their story sounds. That pull-off at mile marker 147 is still there, but I never stop at it anymore. I'd rather drive an extra hour tired than park in that particular darkness again. The break had been long overdue. Weeks of back-to-back meetings, constant messages, and the kind of exhaustion that makes every day blur together had started to eat away at me. When an ad for a digital detox retreat appeared on my laptop screen late one night, the idea sounded perfect. A quiet lodge tucked somewhere in the Oregon countryside. No screens, no distractions, just time to recharge. The price was low enough to make me wonder if it was some new wellness startup trying to build a reputation, but I booked it anyway. I needed silence more than I needed logic. The drive there took most of a gray November afternoon. The roads grew narrower and lonelier the farther I went, the trees swallowing what little sunlight there was. The sign for Airvale Lodge looked almost handmade, nailed to a crooked wooden post by the side of the road. When I finally pulled into the gravel lot, my phone had no signal. I took it as a good sign, a forced break from everything. The main building looked rustic, a wide porch lined with mismatched rocking chairs, and a carved wooden door that groaned when it opened. A woman in a beige uniform greeted me inside. Her voice was gentle but rehearsed, every word precise. She asked for my name, then reached out her hand and said they'd be holding on to all electronic devices for the duration of the program. Before I could protest, another staff member appeared with a tray lined with numbered envelopes. My phone went into one, sealed with a sticker that read "Serenity requires surrender." They gave me a cotton uniform and a name tag. My own name printed in bold black letters. "Participants blend better that way," the woman said with a kind of warmth that didn't invite questions. Dinner that night felt strange. Everyone wore the same pale clothes, moving quietly around the long wooden tables. No one seemed to know each other, but they acted like they did. Smiling, nodding, serving food in synchronized rhythm. The staff stood along the walls, watching, never eating. When I tried to make small talk with the woman sitting beside me, she simply said, "It's easier if you let go of words." I laughed awkwardly, thinking it was part of the retreat's minimalist philosophy, but something about her expression stayed with me through the night. The next morning began with a bell that rang through the halls at dawn. Everyone lined up in the courtyard like students waiting for roll call. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the mist hung low between the trees surrounding the property. A man who introduced himself only as Guide Thomas gave a short speech about releasing digital toxins and rediscovering natural rhythm. His tone was calm, but every sentence carried the kind of certainty that made me uneasy. When I asked how long the program lasted, he smiled without answering. "You will know when it ends," he said, as if it were something obvious. The day unfolded with scheduled silence and strange rituals. We had to walk in single file along forest trails, pause at marked stones, and write affirmations on paper that were later burned in a communal fire pit. Meals were timed to the minute. Every clock in the lodge showed the same hour, even though the sunlight shifted throughout the day. When I asked another participant how long she'd been there, she looked around before whispering. I stopped counting after the third sunrise. Her eyes darted to the nearest staff member. Then she smiled tightly, like she regretted saying it. By the afternoon, the sense of calm that the staff tried to impose had started to crack. I noticed people pacing near the windows or staring too long at the locked gate beyond the main courtyard. I decided to test it myself during a meditation session when everyone's eyes were closed. The gravel path leading to the exit was longer than it looked, and my steps sounded louder than they should have. When I reached the gate, a heavy chain looped through its bars. A padlock the size of my hand hung in the middle. Through the metal, I could see the empty road stretching into the trees. No cars, no signs of movement. Only silence so deep it felt staged. That evening, I went to the front desk and asked for my phone. The receptionist, a young man with perfect posture and a voice too calm, checked a list behind the counter. "You signed the agreement," he said, not even looking at me. "You're here until the program ends. I asked again, louder this time, and he repeated the same line word for word as if rehearsed. A couple of staff members appeared behind him, blocking the hallway. Their faces were blank, but their stance wasn't. That was the moment I realized no one here was simply following wellness routines. They were following orders. That night, I barely slept. The lodge walls seemed thinner, the quiet heavier. From my room window, I could see the courtyard dimly lit by lanterns, shadows moving in slow, deliberate patterns. Around midnight, a low hum echoed through the trees, not an engine or generator, but a rhythmic pulse that grew louder every few seconds. When I opened my door to listen, 2 staff members were standing at the end of the hallway, facing me. Neither spoke, but one raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. I shut the door and pressed my back against it, heart pounding in my chest. The following morning, the woman I'd spoken to at dinner was gone. Her bed was neatly made, her name tag missing from the wall hook. When I asked one of the cleaners where she'd gone, she replied, she completed her process. That phrase circulated throughout the day like a chant, whispered during meals, murmured by staff, written on the whiteboard in the hall. Completion is peace. By then, I understood that no one here was trying to rest or heal. They were being reshaped into something obedient. I decided to escape that night. During the final group meditation, I hid one of the metal utensils from the dining table under my sleeve. When the lights dimmed, I slipped out through a service corridor that smelled of bleach and wet wood. The kitchen door opened to the back of the property, near the same gate I'd tried before. Using the fork, I wedged the chain loose enough to slip it free of the latch. My fingers were raw, the sound of metal scraping metal slicing through the still air. For a second, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. The road beyond the gate stretched into the forest. No lights, no signs, just endless darkness. I walked for what felt like hours until a delivery truck appeared in the distance. The driver, an older man with tired eyes, slowed down when he saw me. I told him I'd been hiking and got lost. He didn't ask questions. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They said there was no record of a place called Airvale Lodge anywhere in the county, and no retreat registered under that name. I have searched for it online since then, and the website that first drew me in no longer exists. I still have the name tag they gave me. Plain white plastic, my name printed in black letters. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, trying to remember the faces of the people still inside those walls. I never saw them again, but sometimes late at night, I hear that same low hum from the woods behind my apartment. The coast feels different once the tourists are gone. The air turns sharp, the sand loses its warmth, and the ocean seems louder, as if it is reclaiming the silence. I had taken a last-minute freelance gig, planning to spend a quiet November in a small beach house outside a fishing village in Maine. The owner's photos showed weathered shingles, pale blue shutters, and a wraparound porch that faced the sea. It looked like the kind of place where time slowed down. Exactly what I needed to finish a photo series before the snow came. The house itself stood a few miles from town, down a narrow road lined with pines. The front steps creaked under my boots as I carried my gear inside. It smelled faintly of salt and old books, the kind of musty comfort that hinted at years of damp air. The layout was simple. Kitchen and living room downstairs, 2 bedrooms on the main floor, and a staircase that ended at a locked door labeled storage only. The host had mentioned that the upper floor wasn't in use, so I didn't think much about it then. That first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon walking along the dunes, catching the late sunlight breaking through thick clouds. When night came, the wind began to howl through the cracks in the window frames. The house groaned and shifted with every gust, but there was something peaceful about it. I made tea, edited a few photos, and fell asleep on the couch with the faint hiss of the ocean outside the window. Sometime in the middle of the night, A sound woke me. It was steady and rhythmic, not the wind, not the surf. Footsteps. Light but deliberate, pacing directly above me. I sat up, the couch springs creaking beneath me, and listened. The steps moved slowly from one end of the ceiling to the other, then stopped. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe pipes, maybe the house settling. But then a faint tune drifted through the air. Music. Something old, scratchy, like a record playing from another room. I turned off the lamp and held my breath, trying to locate the source of the sound. The melody had a strange quality, a waltz maybe, though the notes seemed warped and distant, like it was being played from behind thick walls. I checked the time. It was close to 3 in the morning. I finally grabbed my flashlight and climbed the stairs. Each step made the old boards groan under my weight. When I reached the door, the music stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the dark around me. I tried the handle. It did not budge. Locked. From the inside. I knocked softly, half expecting someone to answer, half hoping no one would. Nothing. My pulse hammered in my ears as I pressed my ear to the wood. Faint shuffling, a drag of movement like someone turning in place. Then, a single thump against the door. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance on the steps. For a moment, I stood there frozen in disbelief, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Eventually, I forced myself back downstairs, locked my bedroom door, and waited for daylight. The morning light made everything seem harmless again. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I had probably been dreaming. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I walked around the outside of the house, camera in hand, tracing the roofline. The upper floor windows were there all right, 3 of them, boarded up, paint peeling away in uneven strips. No lights, no movement. Just the wind rattling the loose boards. I snapped a few photos more out of habit than intention, and went back inside to make coffee. When I messaged the host, I kept it polite. I asked if anyone might have been doing maintenance upstairs, mentioning the music. The reply came quickly. The house doesn't have an upstairs anymore. It was destroyed in a fire years ago. I stared at the screen, rereading it. I could still hear the footsteps in my head, the pattern of them, deliberate and human. I wanted to argue, to ask for proof, but something about the certainty in their message stopped me. Instead, I typed a short thank you and set the phone face down on the counter. That evening, I avoided going near the stairs. I cooked dinner with the radio on just to drown out the creaks of the house. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of seaweed and smoke through a gap in the window frame. I sat in the living room, scrolling through my camera roll, when something caught my attention. One of the exterior shots I had taken that morning. In the reflection of an upstairs window, behind the warped glass, there was a faint outline of a person. The shape was blurred, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been standing there, watching. Sleep was impossible after that. I kept the lights on and stayed by the window until dawn. The next morning, I decided to check the attic space from the outside again. The boards over the windows looked undisturbed, but when I touched the edges, flakes of charcoal rubbed off on my fingers. Beneath the wood, the smell of burnt plaster seeped out, faint but distinct. I followed the scent around the back of the house and found a small hatch hidden under the eaves, sealed with rusted nails. It looked like no one had touched it in years. I packed my things that afternoon, told the host I had a family emergency, and left before the sky darkened. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. The upstairs windows were still boarded, but for a moment I could swear one of the boards shifted slightly, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peer through. I didn't stop to look again. I reached the main road and kept driving until the ocean was only a whisper behind me. Weeks later, when I developed the last roll of film, one photo came out that I didn't remember taking. It was the interior of a narrow hallway, wood-paneled, scorched at the edges, and at the far end, a gramophone stood in perfect condition, the needle resting on a spinning record. I still do not know how it appeared among my shots, but I boxed up that film and never touched it again. Sometimes, when the wind is high, I can still hear that same warped waltz playing in my head. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The ad on Craigslist seemed perfect for someone drowning in student loans like me. $400 a month for a room in a house near campus, utilities included, with 3 other roommates to split the common areas. I'd just turned 23 that April, and after burning through most of my savings on textbooks and ramen, this place felt like a miracle. The landlord, Walter Garrison, met me at the front door on move-in day with a clipboard and a grin that stretched too wide across his face. He walked me through the house, pointing out the thermostat I shouldn't touch, the dishwasher that only worked on the light cycle, and the basement door at the end of the hallway. "Storage down there," he said, jangling his keys. "Each tenant gets a section, but that back room stays locked. Just old tools and equipment from when my father owned the place." I didn't think much about it those first few weeks. Between my nursing program clinicals and my part-time job at the campus bookstore, I barely had time to sleep, let alone worry about locked doors and basements. My roommates were decent enough people who kept to themselves. There was Bradley, an engineering student who lived on energy drinks and barely left his room. Natalie, who worked nights at a call center and slept during the day. And Jerome, who was finishing his MBA and spent most weekends at his girlfriend's place. We crossed paths in the kitchen occasionally, nodded politely, and went about our lives. The house had that weird quality old rentals have, where every floorboard announces your presence, and the walls seem too thin for privacy, but somehow you still feel alone. My room sat directly above the basement, second door on the right from the stairs, with a window that faced the neighbor's fence, and let in exactly 45 minutes of sunlight each afternoon. The coughing started on a Monday night in early October. I remember because I'd just submitted a huge pharmacology paper, and was finally allowing myself 8 hours of sleep for the first time in weeks. Around 2 in the morning, this dry, rasping sound pulled me from a dream about missing an exam. At first, I thought it was Bradley down the hall, maybe catching a cold from all those late nights. But as I lay there in the dark, tracking the sound, I realized it was coming from below. Not just below, but directly beneath my bed. The cough had a muffled quality to it, like someone trying to suppress the noise by covering their mouth with fabric or their arm. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, these horrible wheezing bursts that made my chest hurt just listening to them, and then nothing. Complete silence except for the house settling and Natalie's alarm clock going off down the hall for her 3 a.m. shift. The next morning, I caught Walter in the driveway as he was leaving after fixing the garage door. "Hey, quick question," I said, trying to sound casual while holding my coffee mug like a shield between us. "Is there any way someone could be in the basement at night? I heard some weird noises." He barely glanced up from his phone, already walking toward his truck, a beat-up Ford with a cracked windshield and bumper stickers from 3 different political campaigns. "Probably the water heater," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. "Thing's older than you are, makes all kinds of racket when it kicks on. Had it checked last month, completely safe, just noisy." He pulled out before I could mention that water heaters don't usually cough, and I stood there in my pajama pants and oversized sweatshirt, feeling stupid for even asking. For 3 nights, nothing happened. I started to convince myself that maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or that sound travels weird in old houses, or that Bradley really did have a cold, and the acoustics just made it seem like it came from below. But that Friday, around midnight, the coughing returned. This time it went on for almost 5 minutes, these wet, desperate sounds that made me think of my grandfather in his last days at the hospice where I'd done my first clinical rotation. I grabbed my phone and recorded it, pressing the device against the floor to catch every wheeze and gasp. When I played it back with headphones, I could hear something else between the coughs. A rustling, like papers or plastic bags being moved around, and what might have been the squeak of old mattress springs. I sent the recording to Jerome since he was the only roommate I'd really talked to, and he responded immediately, even though it was past midnight. That's definitely not the water heater. We should check it out. Jerome met me in the hallway 5 minutes later, holding a flashlight he'd grabbed from his car and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. We crept down to the basement like teenagers sneaking out after curfew, testing each step to avoid the creaky spots. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a rental house built in the 70s. Concrete floors, exposed beams, that particular smell of damp cardboard and forgotten things. Our storage sections were clearly marked with masking tape and Sharpie, each tenant's name in Walter's blocky handwriting. Behind a wall of stacked boxes and an old refrigerator that hummed constantly, we could see the locked door. A padlock the size of my fist secured a metal latch that had been added recently, judging by the fresh scratch marks on the worn wood. Jerome aimed his flashlight at the gap beneath the door, and we both saw it at the same time. A thin strip of light, barely visible, like someone inside had a phone charging or a nightlight plugged in. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, just staring at that sliver of light. Then, as if responding to our presence, the light shifted. A shadow passed across it, the unmistakable shape of feet moving on the other side. Jerome grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, and we both scrambled backward, nearly knocking over a tower of Christmas decoration boxes. Neither of us said anything until we were back upstairs in the kitchen, where Jerome poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands and downed it in one go. "We're calling the cops," he said, already pulling out his phone. But I stopped him, some ridiculous part of my brain still thinking about lease agreements and security deposits, and having to find a new place in the middle of the semester. "Let me try Walter one more time," I said. "If he doesn't give me a real answer, then we call." Jerome looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but he put his phone down and waited while I sent Walter a text with the video attached, telling him we knew someone was in the locked room and we needed answers now. Walter showed up 20 minutes later, which should have been my first red flag since he lived 40 minutes away. He was wearing sweatpants and a faded college hoodie, his hair sticking up like he'd just rolled out of bed, but his eyes were wide awake and darting between Jerome and me like he was calculating something. "You kids are being paranoid," he said. But his voice had this thin quality to it, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "That room's been locked for years. Nobody could possibly be in there." I pulled up the video on my phone, turned the volume all the way up and played the coughing sounds. His face went through this series of expressions, from dismissive to concerned to something I couldn't quite read. "Fine," he finally said, pulling out his keys with dramatic reluctance. "I'll show you there's nothing in there but rusty tools and spider webs, and then I don't want to hear about this again." He started toward the basement stairs, then stopped and turned back to us. "Actually, wait here. Insurance liability and all that. I'll go check and come right back." Jerome and I looked at each other and simultaneously decided we weren't letting him go alone. We followed him down, our footsteps echoing his on the wooden stairs. Walter kept muttering under his breath, something about ungrateful tenants and market-rate rentals, but his hands were trembling as he fumbled with the padlock. The key stuck, and he had to jiggle it 3 times before the lock finally clicked open. He pushed the door inward, and the smell hit us immediately. Not decay or waste, but that concentrated human smell of unwashed clothes and stale breath and something medicinal, like cough syrup or benzocaine lozenges. The room was maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a camping cot pushed against one wall, a battery-powered lantern on an overturned milk crate, and grocery bags lined up along another wall. Empty soup cans were stacked in a corner next to a pile of pill bottles. But the worst part was the ceiling. Someone had drilled tiny holes in precise spots, each one positioned perfectly to look up into the rooms above. Into our bedrooms. into our lives. "Oh, God," Walter said, and for the first time he seemed genuinely shocked. "Gordon, what have you done?" That's when we heard the toilet flush from the small bathroom. I hadn't even noticed in the corner, just a toilet and sink behind a curtain made from a shower liner. A man emerged, probably in his 50s, wearing a dingy white undershirt and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He had Walter's same narrow face but none of his nervous energy, just this hollow resignation like he'd been caught doing something inevitable. "I told you they'd find out," Gordon said to Walter, not even looking at Jerome and me. "Told you the girl's room was too close. She was bound to hear me." He sat down on the cot with a wheeze that turned into another coughing fit, this one lasting almost a minute while Walter stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When Gordon finally stopped coughing, he looked directly at me for the first time, and his eyes had this horrible apologetic quality that made my skin prickle. "You take morning showers at 6:15, he said quietly. "Sometimes you sing that song about the astronaut. Pretty voice." Jerome already had his phone out, calling 911 while backing toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't process that this man, Gordon, had been living beneath me for months, watching through those horrible little holes, knowing my schedule better than I did. Walter started babbling, trying to explain that Gordon was his brother, that he'd lost his job and then his apartment, that it was supposed to be temporary, just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. "He's sick," Walter kept saying, as if that explained everything. "He's got respiratory problems, can't afford doctors. I couldn't just leave him on the street." But Gordon wasn't listening to his brother's excuses. He was looking at the holes in the ceiling with this weird pride, running his fingers along the wood. "Had to be real careful with the placement," he said to no one in particular. "Quarter-inch bit, just enough to see through but not enough for anyone to notice from above. The one over your desk is my favorite. You study so hard, writing all those notes about medications and patient care. Sometimes I pretend you're taking care of me." The police arrived within 10 minutes. 3 cars with lights but no sirens. They took Gordon away first, and he went without resistance, just asked Walter to grab his medications from the milk crate. The officers photographed everything, measured the holes, bagged the empty food containers and pill bottles. One of them, a woman with sergeant's stripes, told us we'd all need to give statements, and that the house would be off limits for at least 48 hours while they processed the scene. Walter they arrested too, for criminal facilitation and endangerment. As they led him to the squad car, he kept trying to catch my eye, maybe wanting forgiveness or understanding, but I stared at the ground until the car door slammed shut. Jerome and I sat on the front steps until our other roommates got home. Then we all went to Bradley's girlfriend's apartment, cramming into her living room with sleeping bags and the weird energy of survivors from the same disaster. None of us ever went back to that house except to get our belongings with a police escort. I found a studio apartment the next week that cost twice as much and had terrible water pressure. But the floors were solid concrete and there was no basement, and that was all that mattered. The closing papers for my house came through on a Wednesday morning in late February, and honestly, I should have trusted my gut when the real estate agent kept adjusting her glasses and clearing her throat during the final walkthrough. But after 6 months of crashing on my sister's couch following the divorce, any place with my own walls felt like salvation. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in Riverside Heights, one of those neighborhoods where people still put up seasonal decorations and kids actually played in the yards. Built in 1978, the split level had good bones underneath the outdated wallpaper and worn carpet, nothing that some sweat equity couldn't fix. What really sold me was the price, almost $40,000 under market value, because the previous owner, an elderly woman named Dorothy Brennan, had died in the master bedroom and the family wanted a quick sale. Death didn't bother me. At my age, having just watched my 10-year marriage flatline, I figured I could handle sharing space with whatever energy Dorothy left behind. My first 2 weeks there passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and making lists of everything that needed fixing, from the leaky kitchen faucet to the wood paneling in the den that belonged in a time capsule. The basement became my designated storage area for things I wasn't ready to deal with yet, mostly photo albums and wedding gifts that felt too complicated to sort through. It was your typical unfinished basement, concrete floors and exposed beams, with an ancient furnace that groaned like it was digesting something whenever it kicked on. That's what I told myself when I first heard the noises anyway. Just the furnace doing its 45-year-old furnace thing. The sounds usually started around 2 in the morning, these soft creaking noises that drifted up through the heating vents. Old houses make noise, everyone knows that. And after living in a modern apartment complex where I could hear my neighbor's coffee maker through the walls, a few creaks seemed like a fair trade for actual privacy. Everything changed on a Sunday night in March when I went down to grab my winter boots from storage, because the weather guy promised one last snowstorm before spring. The pull-string light barely reached the corners of the basement, casting these long shadows behind the water heater and the massive boiler that looked like something from a submarine movie. Behind the boiler, tucked into a gap between the unit and the wall, I found 3 Marlboro red cigarette butts arranged in a neat little line on the concrete floor. My whole body went rigid, like when you miss a step going downstairs and your stomach does that horrible flip. Nobody in my family smoked, hadn't had a single visitor who smoked, and the home inspector definitely would have mentioned finding cigarette butts during his inspection. Right next to the butts sat a Poland Spring water bottle, the label peeled halfway off, with maybe 2 inches of water still sloshing around inside. The plastic was soft, like someone had been gripping it recently, and when I picked it up with my sleeve pulled over my hand, the water inside was room temperature, not the icy cold you'd expect from something abandoned in a basement for weeks. I told myself Dorothy's family must have left it when they cleared out her belongings, maybe took smoke breaks while sorting through 40 years of accumulated stuff, even though the house had been empty for 3 months before I moved in. But that night, I barely slept, jerking awake every time the heat kicked on or a tree branch scraped the siding. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had him install new deadbolts on every exterior door, the expensive kind that couldn't be picked by some YouTube tutorial. Then I went through every window in the house, checking locks and adding these metal security bars to the basement windows that the guy at Home Depot assured me would stop anyone bigger than a raccoon. For good measure, I started leaving lights on when I went to bed. The kitchen, the hallway, sometimes the basement too, my electric bill be damned. But even with all that, I kept finding myself standing at the top of the basement stairs at random times, listening for sounds that didn't belong, my hand hovering over the light switch, like I was afraid of what I might see if I turned it on. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I had almost convinced myself that I'd overreacted, that living alone after a decade of marriage had made me jumpy and paranoid about normal house stuff. Then came the morning I found my back door unlocked, the one that led from the kitchen to the backyard, the one I specifically remembered checking twice before bed, because it had become part of my nightly ritual, along with testing every window latch. The door was still closed, just unlocked. The deadbolt turned to the open position like someone had used a key. My coffee mug slipped right out of my hand, shattering on the linoleum and sending hot coffee across my bare feet. But I barely felt the burn. I grabbed my phone and almost called 911. But what would I say? That my door was unlocked and maybe I was just losing my mind from stress. Instead, I called my brother Kevin, who lived 40 minutes away. And while I waited for him to show up, I sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching my own house like it might suddenly reveal its secrets. Kevin spent 2 hours going through the house with me, checking every closet, every corner, even the crawl space above the garage that required a ladder to access. We found nothing missing, nothing disturbed, just that unlocked door that he suggested might be a faulty mechanism, or maybe I'd forgotten despite being certain, absolutely certain, that I'd checked it. But when we went down to the basement to check the window locks, We found something that made Kevin stop talking mid-sentence about getting me a security system. Behind the boiler, in that same spot where I'd found the cigarettes, sat a McDonald's bag, grease-stained and crumpled, with a receipt dated from the previous night at 11:47 p.m. Inside were the remnants of a Big Mac meal, half-eaten, the fries still soft like they'd been sitting there for just a few hours. The smell hit us both at the same time, that distinctive fast food smell that definitely hadn't been there when I'd done laundry in the basement 2 days earlier. Kevin's face went pale, and he pulled out his phone to call the police while ushering me back upstairs, his hand on my back like he was afraid something might grab me if we didn't move fast enough. The police treated it like a standard break-in at first. 2 officers who looked barely older than my nephew taking notes while walking through the house with their hands resting on their utility belts. They found the point of entry within 10 minutes, a basement window on the north side of the house where someone had carefully removed the security bar screws from the outside, the holes hidden behind a rhododendron bush that grew thick against the foundation. The frame showed fresh tool marks where someone had pried it open repeatedly, probably over several nights, working the lock mechanism until they'd figured out how to pop it silently. Officer Ramirez, the one with a thin scar through his left eyebrow, showed me how the intruder had been replacing the screws each time they left, making everything look normal from a casual glance. They documented everything, took photos, dusted for prints around the window and the boiler area, but both officers kept exchanging these looks that made my chest feel tight. When I asked what would happen next, Officer Carson, the younger one with freckles across his nose, said they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but admitted that without cameras or witnesses, catching someone who only came at night would be like finding a specific fish in Lake Superior. That afternoon, I spent $300 I didn't really have on security cameras from Best Buy, the kind that sent alerts to your phone when they detected motion. Kevin helped me set them up, 1 at each entrance, 1 in the hallway, and 2 in the basement, including 1 pointed directly at that window. We also moved my bedroom furniture so my bed sat against the far wall with clear sight lines to both the door and window, and Kevin insisted on installing this metal security bar that wedged under the doorknob, said he'd seen it on some crime show and it actually worked. Before he left, he tried to convince me to stay at his place for a while, but his wife had just had their 3rd kid, and their house was already chaos without adding my drama to it. Instead, I promised to call him every night before bed and first thing in the morning, our own little check-in system that made us both feel better, even though we knew it wouldn't actually stop anything from happening. That first night with the cameras, I sat up in bed with my laptop open, watching the feeds like they were the most important TV show ever made, jumping every time a moth flew past the lens or the timestamp updated. For 3 nights, nothing happened except for a stray cat that triggered the basement camera and nearly gave me a heart attack at 3 a.m. when my phone started buzzing with motion alerts. I'd actually started to relax a little, thinking maybe the police visit had scared whoever it was away, that they'd moved on to some other house without cameras and paranoid owners who checked their locks 15 times before bed. Then on Friday night, exhausted from a week of barely sleeping, I made the mistake of taking 2 Benadryl to knock myself out, figuring the camera alerts would wake me if anything happened. I woke up Saturday morning feeling groggy and disoriented, my mouth dry like I'd been breathing through it all night, and when I checked my phone, there were 14 motion alerts from between 1:47 a.m. and 4:33 a.m. My fingers shook so bad I could barely unlock my phone, and when I finally got the camera app open, what I saw made me run to the bathroom and throw up the nothing that was in my stomach, just bile that burned my throat while tears streamed down my face. The footage showed a man entering through the basement window at 1:47 a.m., moving with the kind of confidence that comes from practice, like he'd done this so many times he could navigate my basement in the dark. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like a maintenance company jacket, the kind with reflective stripes that made him look like he belonged there if anyone happened to glance through a window. The infrared camera made his eyes look like white circles as he walked directly to the stairs, Not hesitating, not searching, just walking like he owned the place. The hallway camera caught him at 2:15 a.m., standing at my bedroom door, his hand on the knob, just standing there for a full 4 minutes without moving. And I realized with horror that he was listening to me breathe, waiting to see if I was truly asleep. Then he opened the door so slowly that it took another 2 minutes for it to fully open, and disappeared into my room where I didn't have a camera, because who puts a camera in their own bedroom? The next footage was him leaving my room at 3:58 a.m., walking backward while carefully closing the door. And in his hand was my phone charger, the pink one with the butterfly sticker that I'd been looking for all week, assuming I'd misplaced it somewhere. I called 911 while still sitting on my bathroom floor, barely able to form words through the sobbing. And this time they sent 3 patrol cars and a detective named Heather Novak, who had this way of making me feel like she actually believed every word I said. When she watched the footage, she immediately recognized something I'd missed in my panic: a small tattoo on the man's left hand, a distinctive pattern that looked like interlocking triangles. She asked me about previous maintenance work on the house, and suddenly, it clicked. The property management company that handled the rental before Dorothy bought it had sent someone to service the boiler just 2 months before she died. Detective Novak made some calls, and within an hour, she had a name: Carl Brenner, 43 years old, who'd been fired from Citywide Property Services 8 months ago for complaints about entering rental properties without notice. The company still had his photo on file, and even though the baseball cap obscured most of his face in my footage, that hand tattoo was unmistakable, those same interlocking triangles he'd apparently gotten during his time in the military, according to his employment records. They arrested Carl that same afternoon at his apartment in Fairfield, just 12 miles from my house, and what they found there made Detective Novak call me personally to come to the station, warning me I might want to bring someone for support. In a back room that Carl used as an office, they found hundreds of photos printed from a computer, photos of me sleeping, photos of me cooking dinner, photos of me watching TV on my couch, all taken from inside my house over the past month. But mixed in with mine were other photos, other women in other houses, some dating back 2 years, each set labeled with addresses and dates in neat handwriting on manila folders. He had keys to 17 different properties, including mine, which he'd apparently copied during his maintenance visits, and a notebook where he documented the routines of each house's occupants: when they slept, when they showered, when they were away at work. Detective Novak said in her 15 years on the force, she'd never seen anything quite like it. This methodical invasion of privacy that wasn't about theft or assault, but something else. Some need to exist in other people's spaces without their knowledge, to watch them in their most vulnerable moments. Carl never said a word during interrogation, just sat there with this blank expression, and eventually asked for a lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor charged him with multiple counts of breaking and entering, stalking, and criminal trespass. The trial happened 6 months later, and by then I'd already moved back in with my sister, unable to sleep in that house even after changing every lock and installing an alarm system that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. During the proceedings, we learned that Carl had been doing this since his divorce in 2017, starting with his ex-wife's apartment, then expanding to places he'd serviced during his maintenance job. The prosecutor brought in a psychologist who testified about voyeuristic disorders and violation of privacy as a form of control, using words like parasitic intimacy that made everyone in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. 16 other women came forward to testify, each with their own version of my story, finding cigarette butts, missing small items, that persistent feeling that someone had been in their space. One woman from Oak Harbor broke down completely when she described finding an impression on her bed's comforter, where someone had laid down next to her while she slept, the shape still visible when she woke up one morning. Carl got 11 years in state prison, eligible for parole in 7 with good behavior, which seems like nothing compared to the life sentence he gave all of us, who can't look at an unlocked door or a basement window without remembering. I sold the house 3 months after the trial, taking a $15,000 loss just to be free of it, and the realtor had to disclose the stalking incident to potential buyers, which meant it sat on the market for 4 months before a young couple from out of state bought it, probably thinking they were getting a deal. Sometimes I drive by there, not intentionally, but that neighborhood sits between my sister's place and the grocery store I like, and I see they've painted it yellow, added a garden, normal life continuing in a space that still shows up in my nightmares. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violation itself, but this one detail from the trial, where they showed a photo from Carl's apartment of a coffee mug he'd taken from my kitchen, my favorite one with a cartoon cat that said "Coffee right meow," sitting on his kitchen counter like it belonged there. He'd been drinking from it every morning while looking at those photos of me, creating this twisted parallel life where he inhabited my spaces even when he wasn't physically there, and that image haunts me more than any footage of him standing in my bedroom doorway, because it means that even when I thought I was alone and safe, some part of my life was always bleeding into his. September in that basement apartment felt like hiding from the world, which was exactly what I needed. Willow Drive wasn't much to look at, just rows of old houses converted into rentals, but at $600 a month I couldn't complain. 29 candles on my last birthday cake, and here I was, starting fresh after Janet and I called it quits. The landlord, an older guy named Frank, lived upstairs with his wife and kept to himself mostly. During move-in day, the neighbor from next door, Gregory, appeared at my door offering to help with the heavy stuff. He was probably in his 50s, thin guy with calloused hands, said he worked night shifts at some warehouse across town. Made a joke about how our basements were identical, just mirror images of each other, while we struggled to angle my couch down those narrow stairs. Even offered to lend me tools if I needed anything fixed, which seemed neighborly enough at the time. After about 2 weeks of living there, small things in my kitchen started seeming out of place. My coffee mug would be turned handle left when I always left it handle right. The wooden spoon I kept in the drawer next to the stove would migrate to the drawer by the sink. A jar of peanut butter I swore I'd pushed to the back of the cabinet would be sitting at the front edge when I got home from my accounting job downtown. Figured my brain was still scrambled from the divorce stress, especially since I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, scrolling through apartment listings for something better while trying to rebuild my savings. Started doubting myself, even wrote notes about where I put things. The kitchen was cramped, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, old appliances that hummed too loud, cracked linoleum that curled at the edges. Then came that Wednesday in October when things got harder to explain away. Left for work at 7:30 sharp like always, and I specifically remember washing my breakfast bowl and placing it upside down on the dish rack. When I got home around 6 that evening, the bowl was right side up with 3 drops of water pooled at the bottom, not just moved but used. The dish soap bottle had shifted from the left side of the sink to the right, and there was a different sponge on the counter, still damp. Called Frank immediately, asked if he'd sent someone down for maintenance, or if maybe his wife had needed to check something. He sounded confused, said nobody had any reason to enter my apartment, reminded me I had the only key besides his emergency copy, which was hanging in his kitchen where it always stayed. That night I couldn't settle down. Kept getting up to double-check the deadbolt, even wedged a chair under the doorknob like my dad used to do when we stayed in sketchy motels during road trips. Around 2 in the morning, lying there in the dark, listening to the furnace cycle on and off, I heard something that made my whole body go rigid. The distinct sound of a drawer sliding open in my kitchen, that specific sticky catch the silverware drawer made because of the humidity. Then the soft rattle of utensils followed by the drawer rolling shut. My bedroom was only about 15 feet from the kitchen, just a thin wall between us. I held my breath, phone already in my hand, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Could hear my pulse hammering in my ears while I waited, listening for footsteps, for any other sound. Another drawer opened, the one with the heavier sound, where I kept the dish towels and oven mitts. The intruder was methodical, unhurried, like someone familiar with the layout. I pressed 911, whispered to the dispatcher that someone was in my apartment, gave the address twice to make sure she got it right. She told me to stay where I was, keep the door locked, officers were on their way. But then I heard something that made no sense at all. The microwave door opened and closed, followed by the beep of buttons being pressed, but no hum of it actually running. Just someone pressing buttons in the dark. The fridge opened next, that broken seal making its characteristic sucking sound, and I could hear containers being shifted around, the clink of glass jars touching. The sirens came within 8 minutes, though it felt like hours lying there listening to someone moving through my kitchen, like they owned it. When the red and blue lights started flashing through those ground-level windows, the sounds stopped instantly. Not gradually, not with footsteps running away, just stopped like someone had hit a switch. The officers knocked loud, announcing themselves, and I practically ran to let them in, explaining about the sounds, pointing toward the kitchen. 2 of them went in with flashlights while a third stayed with me by the door. They checked everything, the closets, the bathroom, behind the water heater, even looked up at the ceiling tiles. The kitchen drawers were all closed. Nothing visibly out of place, but I knew someone had been there. The younger officer, Officer Daniels according to his badge, started asking about windows, pointing out that they were all locked from the inside with no signs of tampering. The door showed no damage either, deadbolt still solid. The older cop, Officer Ruiz, was running his flashlight along the walls, checking for any openings, when he stopped at the back corner of my bedroom. There was a section of wood paneling that looked slightly different from the rest, the grain pattern not quite matching. He pushed on it, and it gave way slightly, like it wasn't properly secured. Called his partner over, and together they pulled at the edges until the whole panel came loose, revealing a rough opening about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. Behind that panel was pure darkness that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate at first. Officer Ruiz got down on his knees, aimed his light inside, and immediately pulled back, calling for backup on his radio. The crawl space extended beyond what the beam could reach, with fresh scuff marks in the dust and what looked like knee prints leading away from the opening. They told me to pack a bag, that I couldn't stay there tonight. While we waited for more officers, Gregory from next door came out in his bathrobe, asking about all the commotion, said the lights woke him up. Stood there on his porch with this concerned expression, arms crossed against the cold, watching everything unfold. Officer Daniels went to question him while Ruiz stayed with me, but Gregory just shook his head, said he'd been dead asleep until the sirens. When backup arrived with better equipment, they sent Officer Park, a smaller woman who volunteered to go through the crawl space with a helmet cam and heavy-duty flashlight. We watched the feed on a laptop in the police car, and my stomach turned as the tunnel curved left, then right, clearly man-made with support beams every few feet. After about 30 feet of crawling, she reached another opening, this one covered by a piece of thin plywood that pushed out easily. She emerged into what looked like another basement, and I heard her radio crackle as she described seeing a workbench with tools, shelving units, and a water heater in the corner. Then she turned her light toward the wall and found something that made everyone in the car go silent. Photos taped up in neat rows, dozens of them, all taken from inside my apartment. Me cooking dinner, washing dishes, even one of me sleeping on the couch after a long day. The detective who'd just arrived, Detective Morrison, immediately got a warrant for Gregory's house while Officer Park stayed in position. Within 20 minutes, they were at his door with the paperwork. Gregory answered calmly, like he'd been expecting them. Didn't even protest when they told him to step outside. Inside his basement, exactly where Officer Park had emerged, they found the other end of the tunnel system. But it was what they found on his workbench that really got to me. My missing spare key from when I'd first moved in. The one I thought I'd misplaced while unpacking. A notebook with detailed schedules of when I left for work, when I got home, when I typically went to bed. Even had notes about my coffee preference and which drawer I kept the batteries in. The photos went back to my second day living there, hundreds of them organized by date in a filing cabinet. They arrested Gregory right there on his porch, didn't even let him go back inside for shoes. As they put him in the patrol car, he looked straight at me through the window, no expression at all, just staring like I was still something to observe. Detective Morrison told me later that Gregory had dug that tunnel over the course of 3 years, long before I'd moved in. The previous tenant, a college student named Ryan, had complained about missing food and moved out after just 2 months. But nobody had believed him about someone being in his apartment. They found photos of Ryan too, tucked in a separate folder, along with images of the tenant before him. Gregory had apparently been using that tunnel for years, treating whoever lived there like his personal reality show. Frank felt terrible about the whole thing, refunded my entire security deposit plus 2 months of rent, even though it wasn't his fault. He had contractors come seal up that wall with concrete, no more panels, no more access points. But I couldn't stay there. Moved in with a coworker for a few weeks until I found a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, one with cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Gregory got 18 months for stalking and breaking and entering, which didn't feel like nearly enough. Sometimes I still wake up at 2 in the morning, listening for drawers opening, for sounds that shouldn't be there. Check my kitchen twice before bed, making sure everything is exactly where I left it. The therapist says it'll fade with time, that hypervigilance after something like this is normal. Maybe she's right, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never live in a basement again. Mason's mother had been gone for 3 months when the noises started in our basement, leaving just the 2 of us rattling around that split-level house outside Columbus. My son was 9. Obsessed with collecting those little metal soldier figures that he'd line up in battle formations across his bedroom floor. We'd grabbed this place in a rush right before school started. One of those 80s builds with yellowish vinyl siding, and a furnace that sounded like it was clearing its throat every time it kicked on. The realtor had knocked $8,000 off the asking price because of the outdated kitchen and the basement that smelled like wet newspaper. But honestly, we just needed somewhere to start over. Mason claimed the upstairs bedroom while I took the master on the main floor, close enough to hear when those nightmares hit him around 2 or 3 in the morning, which happened more often than I'd like to admit. That first Monday in October, I remember specifically because Mason had just brought home straight A's on his report card. I woke up to this metallic scraping sound coming from below, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone filing down a piece of steel. The sound stopped and started in intervals, maybe 10 seconds of scraping, then silence, then scraping again. Mixed in with it, I could hear voices. 2 people having what sounded like a completely normal conversation, though the words were too muffled to make out through the floorboards. My first instinct was to check on Mason since he'd been sleepwalking lately, once even making it all the way to the kitchen where I found him trying to pour cereal at 3 in the morning. But when I cracked his door open, there he was, one arm dangling off the bed, mouth slightly open. Those dinosaur sheets twisted around his legs. The talking downstairs continued, casual and unhurried, like 2 guys discussing a project. I pulled the heavy mag light from my nightstand, the metal cold in my palm, and headed for the basement door off the kitchen. The second I turned the doorknob, everything went dead quiet. That kind of silence that feels intentional, like someone holding their breath. I waited there in my boxers and t-shirt, ear pressed against the door, counting to 30 in my head before flipping the light switch. Click. Nothing. The bulb was dead or missing, leaving just a black hole where the stairs descended. I aimed the mag light down those wooden steps, the beam cutting through dust particles that danced in the air like tiny insects. Each stair groaned under my weight, that old wood sound that makes you wonder if the whole thing might give way. The basement stretched out in front of me, mostly empty except for our moving boxes stacked against one wall and that workbench the previous owners had left behind, its surface covered in rusty brackets and old paint cans. I swept the light across every corner, checking behind the water heater, around the furnace, even inside the utility closet where the electrical panel lived. Nobody. The concrete floor showed no footprints except my own dusty ones from when we'd moved boxes down there. But there was this smell I hadn't noticed before, kind of industrial, like machine oil mixed with something else, maybe rubber or heated plastic. The side door that led out to the backyard was still padlocked from the inside, the tiny window next to it so covered in grime you couldn't see through it even in daylight. For the next few nights I stayed up late, sitting in the living room with the TV on mute, just listening. The house had its regular sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heating ducts ticking as they cooled, but nothing from the basement. Started thinking maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing, or maybe it was mice in the walls, though mice don't usually have conversations. By Friday, I'd almost convinced myself to forget about it, even joked with my coworker Phil about needing more coffee to stop hallucinating. Then the following Wednesday rolled around and everything changed. I'd taken a half-day off work to deal with some paperwork at Mason's school. Something about updating emergency contact information now that his mother was out of the picture. Got back to the house around 1:30 in the afternoon, pulling into the driveway behind a white van I didn't recognize. No company logos, no writing on the sides, just a plain white panel van with tinted rear windows and a license plate so mud-covered I couldn't read it. Before I could even process why there was a van in my driveway, the side door of my basement burst open, and two men came walking out like they owned the place. Both wore those neon yellow reflective vests, the kind construction workers use, hard hats tucked under their arms carrying what looked like metal detectors or some kind of scanning equipment. The taller one, maybe 6'3" with a thick mustache that reminded me of a push broom, saw me getting out of my car and actually waved, casual as could be. The shorter guy, stocky with arms like ham hocks and a neck tattoo peeking out from his collar, was already heading toward the van's rear doors. They moved with this practiced efficiency, no hesitation, no surprise at seeing me, like running into the homeowner was just part of their regular routine. The tall one called out something about checking the lines, gestured vaguely toward the street where I could see orange cones set up that definitely hadn't been there when I left. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, keys still in my hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. These guys had just walked out of my locked basement, the one with the padlock I'd checked myself that morning. The tall one was already at the van, sliding his equipment into the back while his partner climbed into the driver's seat. When I finally found my voice and asked what the hell they were doing in my house, the tall one just pointed at his vest like that explained everything. Mumbled something about Columbia Gas checking for leaks. Routine maintenance. Should have gotten a notice. His partner had already started the engine, revving it impatiently, and before I could ask another question, the tall guy hopped in and they peeled out, leaving tire marks on my driveway. The whole encounter lasted maybe 45 seconds, but something about how smooth it was, how rehearsed, made every alarm bell in my head go off at once. I ran to the basement door, still standing wide open, the padlock dangling from the hasp, somehow unlocked. The mechanism wasn't broken or cut, just opened clean, like they had a key or picked it with professional tools. Down in the basement, that industrial smell hit me stronger than before, and I noticed things I'd missed in the dark with just my flashlight. Fresh scratches on the concrete floor near the wall, like something heavy had been dragged. A section of drywall in the corner looked newer than the rest, the paint slightly brighter white, the texture different. One of our moving boxes had been shifted, and when I checked inside, someone had gone through our old photo albums, a few pictures scattered on the floor beneath the box. The pictures were all of Mason as a baby, birthday parties, first day of kindergarten, him with his mother before she left. My chest got tight seeing those photos touched by strangers' hands, and I grabbed my phone to call the police, but then stopped, realizing how insane this would sound without proof. Instead, I called Columbia Gas first, going through 3 different customer service representatives before reaching someone who could actually check service records. The woman on the phone, Sharon, sounded increasingly concerned as she searched their system, finally telling me in this careful voice that no Columbia Gas crews had been dispatched to my address in over 2 years, and certainly not today. She asked if I wanted to file a report about impersonation, said it was a serious crime, that people sometimes posed as utility workers to case houses for burglaries. While she was talking, I walked around the basement perimeter, running my hand along the walls, and that's when I felt it. A draft coming from behind that newer section of drywall. Not strong, but definitely there. Cold air flowing from somewhere it shouldn't be. Sharon was still talking about security protocols when I grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench and started prying at the edge of that fresh drywall section. The drywall came away easier than it should have, just held in place with a few finishing nails, revealing a hole about 3 feet wide cut straight through the concrete foundation. Professional work, smooth edges, probably done with a concrete saw, the kind contractors use for major renovations. Beyond the hole was a corrugated metal pipe, one of those big storm drain tubes that run under neighborhoods to handle rainwater runoff. The pipe had to be at least 4 feet in diameter, big enough for a grown man to walk through if he hunched over a bit. I could see footprints in the sediment at the bottom, lots of them, going both directions, and that industrial smell was overwhelming now, mixing with the musty stench of stagnant water and decay. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the end of the tunnel in either direction, just disappeared into blackness that seemed to go on forever. Called 911 right then, told them about the break-in, the fake utility workers, and this tunnel I'd just discovered leading straight into the storm drain system. The cops showed up within 10 minutes, 2 patrol cars and then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Detective Hoffman. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he'd slept in it, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail as I walked him through what happened. When he saw the tunnel opening, he immediately called for backup and a crime scene unit, then got on his radio requesting someone from the city's public works department. While we waited, he asked me detailed questions about the 2 men, had me describe everything I could remember, their height, weight, distinguishing features, the van, even the way they walked. The crime scene techs arrived and started photographing everything, dusting for prints on the drywall edges and the padlock, taking samples of the sediment from inside the tunnel entrance. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, told Hoffman she could see tool marks on the concrete, definitely a professional job, probably took days to cut through. The guy from Public Works showed up about an hour later, an older man named Eddie who'd been working the city sewers for 23 years, knew every pipe and drain in Columbus like the back of his hand. He took one look at the tunnel entrance and his face went pale, started muttering about how this section of storm drain had been sealed off in 2016 after a homeless camp got flooded out during heavy rains. Said the city had welded shut all the access points, installed security grates, the whole 9 yards, specifically to keep people from getting in there. But here was proof someone had not only gotten in but had been using it as their own private highway under the neighborhood. Eddie pulled up schematics on his tablet, showing Hoffman where the drain ran, and my stomach dropped when I saw it connected to at least 12 other houses on our street, with multiple entry points that led to maintenance hatches scattered throughout the area. Any of those houses could have the same kind of hidden entrance, and the people living there would never know. Hoffman made the decision to send officers into the tunnel while we evacuated to a hotel. Said it wasn't safe for Mason and me to stay there until they figured out what they were dealing with. I packed bags for both of us while trying not to alarm Mason. Told him we were having an adventure, like camping but in a hotel with a pool. Poor kid was excited about the pool, had no idea why his dad's hands were shaking while folding his dinosaur pajamas. Before we left, I watched them send in 2 officers wearing hazmat suits and headlamps, tethered to safety lines in case the tunnel had any surprises. They came back out 20 minutes later with evidence bags full of stuff they'd found down there. Copper piping that had been stripped from somewhere. What looked like mail from different addresses. Even a laptop in a waterproof case. One of the officers, his face sheet white despite the exertion, told Hoffman they'd found makeshift camps set up at various points, sleeping bags, camp stoves, stockpiles of food, and something else that made him stop talking when he noticed I was listening. Hoffman walked me to my car, said they'd post an officer at the hotel, gave me his card with his personal cell number written on the back, told me to call if I remembered anything else or if anyone tried to contact me. That night at the hotel, Mason splashed in the pool while I sat on a plastic chair watching him, my phone buzzing every few minutes with updates from Hoffman. They'd arrested 6 people by midnight, all found at different points in the tunnel system, including the 2 guys I'd described from my driveway. The tall one with the mustache turned out to be a former city employee who'd been fired from the water department 5 years ago for stealing equipment. His partner was his cousin, both of them with rap sheets full of burglary and theft charges going back a decade. The other 4 were people nobody expected, a woman who worked at a nearby grocery store, 2 brothers who ran a scrap metal business, and most disturbing, a man who'd been reported missing by his family 3 years ago. They'd been living down there, had turned that abandoned storm drain into their own underground network, complete with stolen electricity tapped from junction boxes and water siphoned from supply lines. The metallic scraping I'd heard that first night was them cutting through pipes in neighboring basements, harvesting copper to sell, and the talking was them planning which house to hit next. What really got me was when Hoffman called the next morning to tell me what else they'd discovered. Those photos of Mason they'd been looking through weren't random curiosity. They'd found notebooks in one of the camps with detailed information about every family on our street, schedules, when people left for work, when kids got home from school, who had dogs, who had security systems. My house was marked as single father, 1 child, no dog, basic locks, basement access confirmed. They'd been watching us for weeks before they even cut through our foundation, knew exactly when they could work without being heard, knew I wouldn't be home that Wednesday afternoon because they'd seen me leave at the same time the previous week for Mason's school appointment. The whole operation was sophisticated in a way that made my skin prickle. These weren't just random criminals, but people who'd turned violating others' homes into a science. The city ended up evacuating the entire street for a week, while they sealed every access point with reinforced concrete, installed monitoring equipment, and swept the whole system for anyone else who might be down there. They found 2 more people on the 3rd day, living so deep in the system they hadn't even known about the arrests, surviving on canned goods and rainwater like some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario playing out beneath our suburban street. We never went back to that house. I broke the lease, took the financial hit, didn't care about losing the security deposit or the penalties. Found us the apartment on the 7th floor of a building downtown, one with a doorman, security cameras in every hallway, and most importantly, no basement. Mason adjusted better than I expected, though he still asks sometimes why we had to move so suddenly, why we couldn't go back for the rest of his toys. I tell him the house had problems. Leave it at that. Figure when he's older I'll explain the whole thing if he really wants to know. The nightmares he'd been having after his mother left actually stopped after we moved. Like somehow his subconscious knew we were safer in that concrete tower than we'd ever been in that house with its hidden vulnerabilities. All 8 people they arrested got prison time, sentences ranging from 18 months to 7 years for the ringleaders, though that feels like nothing compared to the violation they put our whole neighborhood through. 6 months later, I ran into one of our old neighbors at a Kroger across town, a woman named Beth who'd lived 3 houses down from us. She told me they'd sold too, couldn't sleep knowing what had been happening literally beneath their feet all that time. Said the whole street had basically emptied out within a year, property values tanked, and the city was still dealing with lawsuits from families who'd discovered evidence of intrusion in their homes during the investigation. Pictures missing, items moved, food taken from refrigerators, little violations that suddenly made sense in the context of what had been discovered. She mentioned they'd found DNA evidence in 7 different houses, proving the tunnel people had been coming up into homes for months, maybe years, whenever they knew families were away. The strangest part was learning later from the prosecution files that the man who'd been missing for 3 years, the one living in the tunnels, had actually chosen to be there, had left his family to join this underground community because he believed society above ground was collapsing. Even now, writing this at my desk in our new place with the city lights twinkling outside, I still check the locks 3 times before bed, still wake up at the slightest unusual sound, still feel that primitive fear when I hear something that reminds me of metal scraping against concrete. The notification from RoomShare popped up on my phone during a particularly rough month in 2022, right when Jenna and I were staring at our credit card statements spread across the kitchen table. We'd bought the house in Denver the previous year, convinced we could handle the mortgage on our combined salaries. But between the car breaking down and her dad's medical bills, things had gotten tight. The basement had its own entrance around the side of the house, a full bathroom, and enough space for someone to live comfortably. So when Jenna suggested renting it out, I figured why not. The app made everything seem so easy and safe, with background checks and verified profiles. And within 3 days, we had our first serious inquiry from someone named Thomas Brennan, who said he worked nights at a warehouse and just needed a quiet place to sleep during the day. Thomas showed up on a Saturday morning to view the space, and I remember thinking how unremarkable he looked. Just an average guy in his 40s with thinning brown hair and clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to blend in, khakis and a plain blue polo shirt. He barely spoke above a whisper when he talked, had this way of nodding along to everything we said, and paid 3 months up front in cash, which should have been my first red flag, but honestly just felt like a relief at the time. He moved in with just 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, said he traveled light because of his job, and for the first couple weeks everything seemed perfect. He was so quiet we sometimes forgot he was even down there, never asked for anything, never complained about the old water heater that made that weird knocking sound, and always left his rent money in an envelope taped to our back door on the 1st of each month, even though I told him he could just transfer it through the app. About a month in, Jenna started mentioning these little things that didn't quite add up, like how she'd never heard him use the microwave or the TV we'd left down there, never smelled food cooking, never heard water running except for the toilet flushing occasionally. She worked from home doing medical transcription and said the basement was dead silent all day, even though Thomas supposedly slept during those hours after his night shifts. We'd see him leaving around 9 at night through the side entrance, always carrying the same black backpack, always wearing dark clothes, and he'd return around 6 in the morning, though sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement through the basement window at odd hours when he should have been at work. The strangest part was the darkness. We never saw lights on down there, not even the glow from a phone screen or laptop, just complete blackness behind those small rectangular windows at ground level. One evening I went down to check the water meter, which was in a utility closet in the basement hallway, and noticed Thomas had installed a deadbolt on his door from the inside, one of those heavy-duty ones you'd see on a front door. When I knocked to ask about it, just making conversation really, he opened the door maybe 3 inches, his face partially hidden in the shadows, and explained in that soft voice that he had expensive equipment for his work and felt better with extra security. The smell that came from his room was odd, not bad exactly, but sharp and chemical, like fresh plastic mixed with something metallic, and I could hear this faint humming sound, maybe a fan or some kind of machine running. He must have seen me trying to peer past him because he shifted his body to block my view completely, then thanked me for understanding about the lock and gently closed the door before I could respond. Jenna had this habit of doing yoga in our bedroom every morning, and one day in early December she came downstairs looking puzzled, saying she kept hearing these tiny clicking sounds while she was in downward dog, like someone tapping a pencil against wood but coming from below. Our bedroom was directly above Thomas's living area, and when we both went upstairs to listen, sure enough, there were these intermittent clicking noises, so faint you had to really concentrate to hear them. I figured maybe he had some kind of hobby, model building or something. People who work nights often have unusual ways to unwind, but Jenna started changing in the bathroom after that. Said she just felt weird about it, even though there was no logical reason. We also noticed our cat, Mango, absolutely refused to go near the basement door anymore. Would hiss and arch his back if we even carried him close to it, which was bizarre because he used to love sleeping on the warm spot where the heating vent came up through the floor there. The night everything went to hell started with me jerking awake at 2 in the morning to the sound of water rushing through the walls, that unmistakable whoosh that means a pipe has given way somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight and ran to the basement door, pounding on it and shouting for Thomas, but got no response, even though his car was in the driveway. The water was already seeping under the door into our hallway, and I could hear it spraying full force somewhere below. I threw my shoulder against the door hard. Once, twice, and on the third hit the frame splintered, and the deadbolt ripped free from the wood. The basement was pitch black, and my flashlight beam caught the water first, cascading from a burst pipe in the ceiling, soaking everything. But as I swung the light around looking for the shutoff valve, I saw something that made my brain just stop processing for a second. The ceiling was covered in holes, dozens of them, each about the width of a quarter, drilled in precise patterns across the drywall. Some had thin cables snaking through them, others were plugged with what looked like small glass lenses, and all of them were positioned directly under the rooms where Jenna and I spent our time. My flashlight caught more details as I stood there in shock. A desk covered in monitors showing grainy green-tinted footage, boxes of electronic equipment I couldn't identify, and notebooks filled with handwritten schedules and observations. The monitors were still running on battery backup, and I could see our living room from above, our kitchen, and worst of all, our bedroom, all filmed from those tiny holes he'd so carefully hidden in the textured ceiling upstairs. One screen showed Jenna asleep in our bed at that very moment, and another had folders labeled with dates going back to the day Thomas moved in. I heard footsteps on the stairs behind me, and Thomas was suddenly there. Not in work clothes, but in dark athletic gear, his face completely different without the meek expression he usually wore, now sharp and focused and calculating. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, then at his equipment, then back at me, like he was doing math in his head about what would happen next. I started backing toward the door, keeping the flashlight aimed at his face, and told him the police were already on their way, which was a lie but seemed like the right thing to say. He smiled then, not the nervous smile I'd seen before, but something confident and practiced, and said in a voice much deeper than his usual whisper that I had no idea how many places he'd been, or how many people had thought they were safe in their own homes. Then he moved faster than I expected, not toward me, but to his desk, grabbing something before sprinting past me and up the stairs, shoving me hard into the wall as he went. By the time I got upstairs, Jenna was standing in the hallway with her phone, saying she'd heard the crash and already called 911, but Thomas was gone, the front door wide open and cold December air rushing in. His car was still in the driveway, which meant he'd fled on foot, probably had another vehicle stashed nearby or someone waiting to pick him up. The whole thing planned out like everything else he'd done. The police arrived within minutes, and I took them down to the basement, which was now ankle-deep in water from the still gushing pipe. But the equipment was still there, those monitors still glowing with their sick green light, showing every private moment we thought we'd had. The detective who specialized in these cases told us to pack some things and find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. Said Thomas had likely been recording everything for months, possibly selling the footage or just keeping it for his own twisted reasons. The investigation revealed things that still make me nauseous when I think about them, like how Thomas Brennan wasn't even his real name. just one of at least 6 identities they could trace. The detective showed us photos from other rental properties in Colorado and Wyoming, where similar setups had been found. Always basement apartments, always couples or single women living above, always the same pattern of holes drilled with surgical precision. They found receipt copies in his desk for specialty surveillance equipment, ordered to different addresses, some dating back 3 years, and a laptop with encrypted files the FBI tech team was still trying to crack. The worst part was learning from the neighbors that they'd seen someone matching his description at odd hours, sometimes just standing in our backyard at night, looking up at our windows, and they'd assumed it was just the tenant getting some air, nothing worth mentioning. We stayed in a hotel for a week while contractors repaired the water damage and patched all those holes, though knowing where each one had been still makes my skin itch when I walk through the house. Jenna couldn't sleep for months, would wake up checking the ceiling with her phone's flashlight, convinced she could hear that clicking sound again, even though Thomas was long gone. We had a security system installed, cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors, the whole deal, which felt ironic given what had happened, trading one form of surveillance for another. The detective called a few times with updates, said they'd connected Thomas to at least 12 similar cases across 4 states, but he'd vanished completely, probably using another identity they hadn't uncovered yet, maybe already setting up in another basement somewhere, drilling his neat little holes while some unsuspecting couple slept above him. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when I swear I saw him across the street. Same height, same thinning hair, wearing those generic clothes meant to blend into any crowd. My whole body went rigid, and I stood there watching as he walked into a hardware store, probably buying more drill bits, more tiny cameras, more cables to snake through someone else's ceiling. I called the detective immediately, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone, and the store's security footage showed someone who looked similar but not quite the same, though the detective admitted these guys were experts at changing their appearance just enough to create doubt. We ended up selling the house 2 months after that, took a loss on it but didn't care, just needed to be somewhere he'd never been, somewhere without a basement, somewhere we could shower and sleep and live without wondering what might be watching from inside the walls. The new buyers were a young family with kids, and I wanted to warn them, to tell them everything. But my lawyer said we'd disclosed what we legally had to, and anything more might be seen as trying to sabotage the sale. So I just handed over the keys and hoped they'd never need to find out why we'd installed so many locks. The conference in Seattle wasn't something I could skip, not with the promotion hanging in the balance and my boss watching every move I made. Hotels downtown were charging $300 a night minimum, which would have blown through my travel allowance in 2 days. So I scrolled through Airbnb until I found something reasonable. $60 a night for a whole house seemed too good to pass up, even if it meant a 40-minute drive to the convention center each morning. The listing showed a charming craftsman-style place with original hardwood floors and vintage fixtures, the kind of house my grandmother would have loved. The host, Martin, had stellar reviews, mostly from business travelers like me who praised his quick responses in the peaceful neighborhood. I booked 5 nights without hesitation, figuring I'd just need a clean bed and a hot shower after 12-hour days at the conference. Martin met me at the house on Sunday evening, right as the October rain started picking up. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with perfectly combed hair and clothes that looked like he'd ironed them twice. His handshake lasted a beat too long, and he maintained this intense eye contact while explaining the house rules, like he was trying to memorize my face. The place was exactly as advertised, maybe even nicer, with fresh flowers on the dining table and a welcome basket full of local coffee and snacks. He walked me through each room, pointing out the thermostat, the Wi-Fi password taped to the router, the extra towels in the linen closet. When we reached the hallway, he stopped at a white door near the kitchen and his whole demeanor shifted. His voice dropped lower, more serious, as he explained that this was the basement door, and it needed to stay locked at all times. Something about ongoing renovations, exposed wiring, insurance liability, the usual concerns that property owners have. He actually pulled on the handle to show me it was secured, then watched me nod in understanding before his smile returned. The first 2 nights passed without incident. I'd leave early for the conference, grabbing coffee from the kitchen while the house sat silent in the pre-dawn darkness, and return after 10 each night, too exhausted to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The house had this settled quietness that old places develop, with the occasional creak of wood, adjusting to temperature changes, or pipes ticking behind the walls. On Monday night, I'd actually stood in the hallway eating takeout Chinese food, staring at that basement door while wondering what kind of renovation required such strict warnings. The door looked ancient, with layers of white paint that had yellowed at the edges, and an old-fashioned keyhole beneath the modern deadbolt Martin had installed. I even bent down once to peek through the keyhole, seeing nothing but black, before feeling ridiculous and heading to bed. Wednesday changed everything. The conference ended early due to a speaker cancellation, so I got back to the house around 6 instead of my usual 10:30. I decided to take advantage of the extra time, pouring myself wine from a bottle I'd bought and settling onto the couch with my laptop to review presentations. The house felt different in the evening light, more lived in somehow, like someone had just stepped out for groceries. Around 8, while I was deep in a spreadsheet, I heard this rhythmic creaking from somewhere below. My first thought was the washing machine, maybe on an automatic cycle, but Martin hadn't mentioned any appliances in the basement. The sound continued for maybe 10 minutes, steady and deliberate like footsteps pacing back and forth on old wooden stairs. I actually muted my laptop and pressed my ear to the floor, trying to locate the source, but the moment I did, the sound stopped completely, as if someone down there had heard me listening. I texted Martin about the noise, trying to keep it casual, asking if there was any automated equipment in the basement that might be running. He replied within seconds, which struck me as odd for 8 at night, saying it was probably just the old boiler system settling for the evening and apologizing if it disturbed my work. His response should have been reassuring, but the speed of it, like he'd been waiting for my message, made me uneasy. I went back to my spreadsheets, but concentration was impossible. Every small sound made me look up, and I found myself glancing repeatedly at that hallway where the basement door waited. Around 9, I heard what sounded like metal scraping against wood, just once. Brief but distinct. I grabbed my phone to text Martin again, but stopped, realizing how paranoid I'd sound complaining about every little noise in an old house. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness of the guest bedroom listening to the house breathe around me, trying to separate normal settling sounds from anything else. Sometime after midnight, maybe closer to 1, I heard the definitive sound of footsteps beneath the floorboards. Not the random creaking of old wood, but a clear pattern. 7 steps one way, a pause, 7 steps back. The counting became automatic, something my brain did without permission, and with each repetition, the pause grew longer. During one of these pauses, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed. The distinct sound of a doorknob turning, that specific metallic click and release. I knew immediately which door it was, even from the bedroom. My phone was in my hand before I'd made the conscious decision to grab it, thumb hovering over the emergency call button while I strained to hear what would come next. The footsteps that followed were different, heavier and more deliberate, moving through the hallway toward the living room. I could track them by the way different floorboards complained under the weight, each creak mapping out a path through the house I'd walked myself just hours earlier. They stopped near the couch where I'd been working, and I heard the unmistakable sound of papers rustling. My work documents were still spread across the coffee table, including contracts with my company's letterhead, my business cards, even my travel itinerary with my home address printed at the top. The silence that followed felt deliberate, like someone reading, absorbing information. Then came a sound that nearly made me call out, The wine glass I'd left on the table being picked up and set down again, the faint ring of glass meeting wood echoing in the darkness. I did the stupidest thing possible. I got out of bed and crept to the bedroom door, pressing my face against the wood to listen better. The living room was maybe 20 feet away, a straight shot down the hallway, and whoever was out there would only need to turn the corner to see my door. But I had to know if this was real or if I was having some kind of exhaustion-induced breakdown. My hand found the doorknob, turned it with excruciating slowness to avoid any sound, and I opened the door just enough to peer out with one eye. The hallway was dark, but streetlight from the living room windows created this dim gray twilight, enough to see shapes and shadows. And there, standing beside the coffee table with my papers in his hands, was Martin. He was wearing different clothes than when he'd met me on Sunday, a worn undershirt and sweatpants like he'd been sleeping. But what made me pull back and nearly gasp aloud was realizing he was barefoot, and his feet were dirty, covered in what looked like dust or soil, leaving faint prints on the hardwood floor. I closed the door with infinite care, turned the lock so slowly that it took nearly 30 seconds for the bolt to fully engage, then backed away until my legs hit the bed. My mind was racing through possibilities, each more insane than the last. Maybe he'd forgotten something important and had a spare key. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was checking on the property. But none of that explained why he'd come through the basement or why he was going through my personal papers at 1 a.m. I could hear him moving again, those dirty feet padding across the floor toward the kitchen. The refrigerator opened, stayed open for maybe a minute, then closed. Water ran in the sink. Normal sounds that became terrifying because they shouldn't be happening. I started recording video on my phone, not of him, but of the door crack where light might show movement, evidence that I wasn't imagining this. The next sound was worse than anything before. The squeak of weight settling onto the couch springs, like he was making himself comfortable in the living room. I could picture him out there, maybe still holding my papers, sitting in the dark just 30 feet from where I was hiding. My phone showed 1:47 a.m., and I made the decision to wait him out, to stay locked in this room until daylight, then get out and never come back. But around 2:30, after nearly an hour of silence, I heard him stand and walk back toward the hallway. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and I swear I could hear breathing. This slow, measured rhythm, like someone trying to detect signs of consciousness from within. My own breath stopped entirely, my whole body rigid under the covers where I dove the moment he'd started moving. The doorknob rattled once, just a gentle test, finding it locked. Then nothing for maybe 5 minutes. Absolute stillness before those footsteps retreated back toward the kitchen, and that basement door opened and closed with its familiar creak. I didn't sleep, not for 1 second. I sat on that bed with my back against the headboard, phone clutched in both hands, watching the door and listening to every sound the house made for the rest of the night. When gray dawn light finally crept through the curtains, I threw everything into my suitcase without folding anything, not caring about wrinkles or organization. I waited until 6:30, when the neighborhood would have people heading to work, witnesses around if something went wrong, then unlocked my door and walked straight to my car without looking anywhere but forward. Before driving away, though, I had to know. I walked around the back of the house, my keys gripped between my fingers like claws, until I found it. A storm door cellar entrance, the kind with angled metal doors that lead from outside directly into the basement. The padlock that should have secured it was hanging open, and there were fresh scrape marks in the dirt, where the doors had been repeatedly opened. The grass around it was worn down to bare earth in a rough path that led to a cluster of trees where the property line ended. When the police searched the basement 3 hours later, after I'd called them from a Starbucks parking lot 10 miles away, they found a makeshift living space behind the boiler. A sleeping bag, camp stove, boxes of canned food, and a milk crate full of items taken from previous guests. A watch, several driver's licenses, pieces of jewelry, phone chargers, even underwear. Martin had been living down there for months, they said, entering through that outside entrance and moving through the house at night while guests slept above him. The detective who called me later said they'd found notebooks where he'd written detailed observations about each guest, what time they went to bed, their daily routines, phone conversations he'd overheard through the floorboards. My name was already there, along with notes about my conference schedule and a sketch of my face that was disturbingly accurate. They arrested him at his actual apartment across town, where he'd been maintaining the appearance of a normal life while essentially living beneath his rental property, surfacing at night like some kind of human rodent to study the people who'd paid him to feel safe. There are nights when silence feels heavier than usual, like the whole house is waiting for something to happen. I remember one of those nights vividly, mostly because it started out so ordinary. I had just come home after another long evening shift at the diner where I worked. My routine was always the same: drop my keys on the counter, kick off my shoes, and heat up whatever leftovers were still in the fridge. That night, though, when I walked through the kitchen, I noticed a faint glow coming from the hallway that led to the basement door. The light was on down there, which didn't make sense. I never used the basement except to store tools and boxes that hadn't been touched in years. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I must have flipped the switch by accident one morning when I was half awake. Still, something about that dim yellow light spilling under the door made me uneasy. The basement always had this strange, still air about it, like time stopped at the bottom of those steps. I opened the door and stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I was just being ridiculous. The bulb buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the concrete floor. I almost turned it off right then, but curiosity got the better of me. When I went down, I noticed how thick the dust layer had gotten since the last time I'd been there. You could see every small print from mice, the outline of old pipes, and my own footprints from months ago. Near the far wall, close to the furnace, I spotted something new. A few half-formed boot prints, much larger than my own. The shape was distinct, almost recent, like someone had walked there not long ago and disturbed the dust just enough to leave a clear mark. I told myself maybe the plumber had left them when he came by earlier that year, but deep down, I knew he never walked that far in. That image of those footprints stuck with me the rest of the night. I went back upstairs, double-checked every lock, and tried to sleep with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. But around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a faint metallic sound echoing through the vents, like something lightly brushing against the inside of the ducts. Came again, slower this time, followed by a hollow tap that seemed to move across the house. I stared at the ceiling, counting each sound, pretending it was just the heating system settling. But the truth was, I had never heard those noises before. The next morning, I checked the basement again, hoping to find something that would make sense of the noise. Everything looked the same cold air, same quiet hum from the furnace. Still, I could not stop staring at those footprints. I knelt down, touched the dust, and realized the top layer seemed freshly disturbed again, like someone had stepped there after I had gone upstairs. I told myself it must have been airflow from the vents, or maybe a small animal. But that explanation did not sit right. The house was sealed up tight, and I had not seen a single mouse in years. 2 nights later, the metallic sounds returned, sharper this time. They moved from one vent to another, like something crawling through the ductwork. Then came a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. It was so subtle that I almost ignored it, but the smell lingered long enough for me to notice where it came from, the vent near my bed. I sat there for what felt like an hour, just listening. The furnace was off. The house was still. But that smell, cheap, acrid tobacco, seeped out from below, mixing with the stale air of my room. I could not remember the last time anyone had smoked inside this house. I barely slept that night, and when dawn came, I decided to check the basement again. The air down there was heavier, colder, and the smell of smoke was stronger. I noticed a few ashes on the concrete near the furnace, tiny gray flakes scattered close to the vent opening. That was when I noticed something odd behind the furnace. There was a narrow panel of metal, slightly misaligned. When I crouched and looked closer, I realized it was not part of the furnace at all, but a piece of sheet metal wedged over a small opening in the wall. Behind it, a dark void stretched deeper than I could see. I hesitated before pulling it aside. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. When I finally shifted the metal enough to look inside, a faint draft hit my face, cool and stale. The crawl space was cramped and uneven, with old insulation hanging like cobwebs. I shined my phone's flashlight in and saw a few things that made my chest tighten. A crumpled blanket, an empty can of beans, and a half-burned cigarette resting on a brick. Someone had been staying down there, watching, listening. I backed away slowly, not sure what to do next. I stood there, gripping the edge of the furnace, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. It was not just that someone had been living down there, it was that they had been close enough to hear everything I did. Every step, every door opening, every phone call. I thought about the faint sounds I'd brushed off for weeks. It all fit together now in the worst possible way. The vent outside must have been their entrance, hidden behind the shrubs near the side of the house. I never noticed it before because I hardly went back there. I backed away and called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain. The dispatcher told me to wait outside until officers arrived. Standing in the driveway, I could see the faint glow of my basement light through the small window near the ground. It was strange, knowing that someone might still be in there, maybe watching me from the shadows. When the officers finally arrived, they went inside with flashlights and weapons drawn. I heard one of them yell something, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the floor. They pulled out a man who looked like he had not slept in days. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes darted around like a cornered animal's. The officers said he had been sneaking in at night through the vent, hiding in that crawl space whenever I was home. There were food wrappers, cigarette butts, and even a small radio tuned to static. He had made himself comfortable in my walls, using the ducts to listen to me move from room to room. The realization made my chest feel hollow. I had been living above him, completely unaware, for who knows how long. After they took him away, I had every vent sealed and the crawl space welded shut. The house felt different after that. Quieter, but not in a peaceful way. Sometimes late at night, I still catch myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to see that faint yellow light seeping out again. It has been months since it happened, but I cannot shake the feeling that the silence in this house is not empty anymore. It feels like it is waiting, listening, just like he once did.